Chapter 669. Late at night, the sky was filled with stars. Starlight flickered as if countless eyes were blinking. It was indescribably deep and boundless. At the foot of the sword observation peak, Chu Mu was fully focused. He maintained a high level of mental power output. He sensed the Tianfu star's power in the air and drew it into his spiritual world to refine his mental power. Sensing the heavenly palace star's power took Chu Mu 2 full nights. Only now did he begin to guide a sliver of it into his mental world to refine it. However, the heavenly palace star was truly too far from the ground. The power of the star was extremely weak, and he could only guide a sliver of it. The refining effect was rather weak. Chu Mu knew that this would be a long process unless he could clearly sense the power of the stars in a special place. At dawn, the power of the stars became even weaker. Chu Mu ended his cultivation and began to use the mind-tempering technique to recover his exhausted mental power. Because he hadn't even learned the basics of the Southern Dipper mind-tempering technique, he naturally couldn't use it to recover. The fact that the Southern Dipper mind-tempering technique was so difficult to cultivate also meant that it had boundless potential. Today was the day of Qin Shanhe's battle with Xikongzhan. The time was set for the afternoon. But it was only 10 in the morning, and a large number of swordsmen had already gathered around the first arena. Moreover, even more swordsmen were rushing over from afar. It was very lively. They were afraid that they wouldn't be able to get a good spot to watch the battle if they were too slow. At noon, the first arena was packed with people. It was so crowded that not even a drop of water could trickle through. Circle after circle of people surrounded the arena. At a glance, it was very shocking. Time slowly passed. It felt like every second was like a year. Finally, the sound of wind breaking rang out at the same time. Two figures rushed over from different directions. In the blink of an eye, they flew over the crowd. One of them had a perfect height, and his figure was just right. He was like an arrow that had left the bow. His body emitted an aura that made all things in the world submit. He was like an emperor that had descended. His starry robe fluttered in the wind, and specks of starlight filled the air. It was very dazzling. The other figure was tall and sturdy. As soon as he appeared, he gave off a heavy pressure. He was like a flying mountain or a surging river, surging violently. Two completely different figures with completely different auras collided in the air above the sword battle arena, causing explosive sounds to ring out. Waves of invisible waves of air surged and charged in all directions, causing the hair of the surrounding swordsmen to flutter. Their robes fluttered, and their eyes unconsciously narrowed. Xikongzhan was the first to land on the sword battle arena. It was as if he had leaped down from the stars. His figure was straight, and it was as if he was pointing at the stars. Qin Shanhe landed after him. With a boom, it was as if a mountain had landed heavily on the sword battle arena, causing it to shake instantly. Xikongzhan, I've experienced life and death battles outside the sword palace for over a year for the sake of fighting you today. Qin Shanhe pulled out his giant sword. The wind howled as sword pressure wreaked havoc, pressing towards Xikongzhan. At the same time, he roared loudly, sounding like a great bell being rung. A year ago, you were no match for me. Now, you are still no match for me. Xikongzhan's posture was calm. His hands were behind his back, and the eyes on his indifferent face were as deep as the stars. He spoke neither slowly nor quickly, completely disregarding Qin Shanhe. Whether I'm your match or not, you will know soon enough. Qin Shanhe was not angry at all. Instead, he laughed loudly. His laughter was filled with power, causing the air to vibrate. Immediately after, Qin Shanhe's power exploded. His tall and muscular body broke through the air and shot towards Xikongzhan like a cannonball. With his giant sword as the vanguard, he suddenly stabbed forward, piercing through the air before him. This sword was powerful and heavy. The terrifying sword pressure was the first to arrive. The swordsmen watching behind Xikongzhan all felt that it was difficult to breathe. It was as if the mountains and seas were overturning, as if the mountains and rivers were crushing. Facing this powerful sword, Sikong Zhan did not move at all. Chu Mu's eyes lit up as he watched from below. He seemed to be deep in thought. After coming to the ancient world, there were many things that were beyond his expectations. For example, the control and cultivation of the ancient world's power. Here, the swordsmen he saw fighting did not use any sword skills or sword Dao. Instead, they used their own sword Dao and various types of power to transform and integrate into their control of power. If they had reached the advanced realm, they would even use it at the right time, exploding with power to form a fatal blow. It could be said that although it was also a battle, the battle between swordsmen of the ancient world looked more simple and concise than the battle between swordsmen of the ancient sword continent. However, the application of changes was more abundant. Qin Shanhe's battle opened Chu Mu's eyes once again. It was different from the battle style of ordinary swordsmen of the ancient world. There was something unique integrated into it. Chu Mu guessed that it might be the essence of the sword Dao that Qin Shanhe had inherited, which he had extracted and integrated into it. The giant sword instantly approached Sikong Zhan. Only then did Sikong Zhan move. He did not use his sword, but only pointed out a finger. Starlight condensed and bloomed at the tip of his finger. With a ding, Sikong Zhan's body floated back. The giant sword trembled and moved to the side. Sikong Zhan flicked his finger lightly. Strands of sword light shot out like shooting stars. Every strand shot towards the weakest part of Qin Shanhe's body. It showed Sikong Zhan's amazing ability to find flaws. Qin Shanhe's expression changed slightly. The giant sword danced and the sword wind roared. It was like the impact of a long river, shattering all the starlight. Then, Qin Shanhe's left hand shook, and a strange short sword appeared. It was instantly connected to the tip of the giant sword, turning the giant sword into a strange weapon with one long and one short sword. Sikong Zhan, I've practiced this move for more than a year. Now I'll let you have a taste of its power. As he spoke, Qin Shanhe rushed forward. In the blink of an eye, he approached Sikong Zhan in an unbelievable way and attacked with the giant sword. Qin Shanhe's swordsmanship immediately underwent a great change. It became unpredictable, which made Chu Mu's eyes light up. The giant sword was huge and heavy. It walked the path of strength and violence, while the short sword that was connected to it walked the path of lightness and strangeness. The combination of strength and violence and lightness and strangeness were displayed in the same sword weapon. Especially Qin Shanhe's swordsmanship. It was different from holding the sword with both hands. Instead, he combined the two swords, one long, one short, one thick, and one thin, so that he could attack from both sides. In the blink of an eye, it became a lightness and strangeness sword. Qin Shanhe's footwork also underwent a great change. It was as if he was walking between mountains and rivers. He became far away in an instant, then close in the next instant. This sudden change in distance caused the surrounding swordsmen to feel a sense of visual confusion, causing their eyes to ache. Sikong Zhan's eyes slightly narrowed, and his pupils seemed to have transformed into two stars as he suddenly drew his sword. His sword was covered with starlight. When he attacked, it was as if there were cold stars flowing in the sky. A unique, profound aura suddenly spread out. Star Profound. Chu Mu was shocked. Star Profound was also one of the basic Profound. To put it simply, other than the variant Profound, all other Profound belonged to the category of Fundamental Profound. Even the Supreme Profound of Space was no exception. Although they were all basic profound meanings, there were still differences between them. If profound meanings were to be divided into 3 levels, then Time Profound and Space Profound would be ranked at the first level, Star Profound would be ranked at the second level, and 5 Elements and 8 Phases Profound would be ranked at the third level. The mutated Profound was only purer than the basic Profound. However, after the Profound reached perfection and went through refinement, the advantage would gradually disappear. Therefore, the mutated profound was only useful before it reached perfection. Its potential after that was not as great as the basic profound. Pure star ultimacy ripples spread out. Obviously, he had reached the third revolution. In terms of power, the third revolution of Star Profound was definitely close to the fourth revolution of 5 elements and 8 aspects. Sikong Zhan's fighting style seemed to be more profound than Qin Shanhe's. Chu Mu's eyes lit up again. As he swung his sword, starlight flowed. The starlight spun under a strange power. It was like a whirlpool that attacked and strangled. It immediately restrained Qin Shanhe's unique sword skill. Sword Technique Domain Level 4. Chu Mu was shocked again. There was a huge difference in strength between Sikong Zhan without his sword and Sikong Zhan with his sword. With a shout, Qin Shanhe unleashed the power of the third level of Sword Technique Domain to the extreme. The power exploded and the advanced realm sword instantly knocked Sikong Zhan's sword away. The giant sword turned around and the short sword stabbed towards Sikong Zhan's chest from a strange blind spot. With a sword in hand, the stars in the sky seemed to listen to my command. A ray of starlight appeared in front of the short sword, as if it had a life of its own and blocked the attack. As the sword slashed down, the starlight parted automatically. It was as if the stars in the sky had been cut apart. Qin Shanhe had no choice but to block with his sword. The sword looked light, but Qin Shanhe could not help but take 3 steps back. Sikong Zhan seemed to be pushed by the starlight. He stabbed again and Qin Shanhe had no choice but to block again. Sikong Zhan's sword skill was neither fast nor slow. It was calm and unhurried. It was as if he was taking a stroll in the garden or admiring the stars in the backyard. There was an indescribable charm and rhythm. Qin Shanhe lost the chance to attack, and could only block again and again. His unique sword skill could no longer be used. There were countless specks of starlight around Sikong Zhan. It was like a dream and made people feel unreal. Every speck of starlight was either extremely hot or extremely cold. Qin Shanhe spread his legs and squatted down slightly. He held the giant sword in front of him with both hands and displayed a purely defensive posture, blocking Sikong Zhan's attacks again and again. Sikong Zhan's sword did not look fast at all, but the connection between each strike was almost perfect. He controlled the rhythm of the attack, and did not give Qin Shanhe any chance to counterattack. In the eyes of the swordsman, Qin Shanhe was only blocking Sikong Zhan's attacks again and again. Chu Mu could see that Qin Shanhe was having a hard time blocking, while Sikong Zhan seemed to be doing it with ease. "Don't you have any other moves?" A long sigh came from Sikong Zhan's mouth, but Qin Shanhe was unable to reply. Sikong Zhan swung his sword. This sword was silent, but the moment it touched Qin Shanhe's giant sword, its power suddenly exploded like a star exploding. With a boom, Qin Shanhe's body flew backwards like a cannonball. Blood sprayed into the air as the giant sword left his hand and flew high into the sky. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Qidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 670. With a bang, Qin Shanhe landed below the arena. With another bang, the huge sword stabbed into the ground and trembled slightly. This battle was longer than the one a year ago, but the swordsman could see that Qin Shanhe had used all his strength, while Sikong Zhan had not. In other words, Sikong Zhan's improvement in strength was more obvious than Qin Shanhe's. The gap between them was even bigger. As the person involved, Qin Shanhe knew even better. He could not help but feel slightly dejected. He originally thought that after going through over a year of life and death battles outside the Sword Palace, he should have been able to close the gap between him and Sikong Zhan by constantly increasing his strength. When he challenged Sikong Zhan, Qin Shanhe didn't think that he could defeat him. He just wanted to prove his improvement. He didn't think that the gap between him and Sikong Zhan would be even more obvious. With a gloomy expression, Qin Shanhe stood up and put his huge sword back into the scabbard on his back. He glanced at Sikong Zhan on the arena, then turned around and left. His tall and strong back seemed a little lonely. The countless swordsmen in the surroundings were silent. At this moment, they didn't know what to say. Was Qin Shanhe too weak? No, Qin Shanhe was very powerful. Defeating Fei Kong was a kind of proof. Being the second-place official disciple for many years was also a kind of proof. However, the powerful Qin Shanhe was defeated by Xikong Zhan's sword, and Xikong Zhan didn't even use his full strength. This could only mean one thing. Xikong Zhan was very powerful, terrifyingly powerful. He was so powerful that it made people tremble. The same thought appeared in the minds of the swordsmen at the same time. Just how powerful was Xikong Zhan? Standing on the arena, starlight revolved around Xikong Zhan like a river of stars. That man, that figure, was like a king under the starry sky. No one could compare to him. The eyes of the 13 generals were filled with burning worship. If Xikong Zhan asked them to go east, they would definitely not go west. If he asked them to kill themselves, they wouldn't hesitate. Chu Mu was shocked by the aura that Xikong Zhan was emitting. Just his aura alone was able to affect the surroundings. The swordsman's eyes were filled with intoxication. Terrifying, absolutely terrifying Xikong Zhan. Chu Mu had raised the importance of Xikong Zhan by a few levels. He had listed him as the strongest enemy he had ever faced. It seemed that Xikong Zhan had done it deliberately. He had used the remaining power of defeating Qin Shanhe to release his aura and fuse it with the aura of the Star Power Upanishad. He had used a special method to affect the surroundings. Only those whose spiritual willpower was stronger than Xikong Zhan's would not be affected, such as Chu Mu. The other swordsman's spiritual willpower was not as strong as Xikong Zhan's. Xikong Zhan, 2 months from now, here and now, let's fight. Chu Mu suddenly spoke. His voice didn't seem to be loud, nor was it fierce, but it contained a kind of will that couldn't be disobeyed, and it instantly broke the terrifying aura created by Xikong Zhan. The swordsmen around Chu Mu were the first to wake up. Confusion flashed across their eyes. Following that, the other swordsmen woke up one after another. Interesting. Xikong Zhan looked at Chu Mu, looking down at him from above. His eyes were like cold stars. For the first time, a faint smile hung on the corner of his mouth. Inwardly, he was surprised by Chu Mu's powerful spiritual willpower, which was not inferior to his own. Xikong Zhan, do you dare to accept my challenge? Chu Mu ignored Xikong Zhan's terrifying aura and spoke again. If you want to challenge me, sure. Xikong Zhan recovered his indifferent expression and said neither too fast nor too slow. First, defeat the 13 warriors under my command. Then, prove that you have the qualification to challenge me. The 13 warriors immediately looked at Chu Mu. Their eyes were like sharp swords shooting at him, as if they wanted to pierce through Chu Mu's body. A normal swordsman would immediately feel uneasy under the stare of the 13 warriors, and his face would change color. However, Chu Mu ignored it. All right, Chu Mu said calmly. Interesting. Xikong Zhan said 2 more words and turned around. The swirling starlight around him disappeared, as if it had disappeared into the void. Xikong Zhan also walked down the arena. The crowd automatically parted to form a path, as if they were respectfully sending off a king. Only when Xikong Zhan's figure disappeared did the swordsmen start to boil. Too terrifying. Xikong Zhan is too terrifying. Yeah, so powerful. Even a strong person like Qin Shanhe was no match for him. Moreover, his aura, speaking of the aura that Xikong Zhan emitted, the swordsmen's faces changed drastically. Luckily, Chu Mu spoke and woke us up. Otherwise, the seed of worship for Xikong Zhan would have been planted in our hearts. Worshipping the strong was a very normal and natural thing, but that was under the circumstances of taking the initiative. No one would be willing to be in a passive situation where they were not very clear about it. Speaking of which, Chu Mu seemed to have proposed a battle with Xikong Zhan in 2 months' time, here and now. That's right, I definitely didn't hear wrong. After Qin Shanhe, Another person has issued a challenge to Xikongzhan. Previously, Chu Mu said that he would challenge Xikongzhan in half a year's time. Now that more than 2 months have passed, he finally issued a challenge to Xikongzhan. Xikongzhan just defeated Qin Shanhe, and the strength that he displayed was unbelievably strong. Under such circumstances, Chu Mu actually dares to issue a challenge. It seems like he's planning to go all out. Not necessarily. Maybe Chu Mu also intends to use this pressure to improve himself by leaps and bounds. This guess was not wrong. Chu Mu did have such intentions. The greater the pressure, the greater the motivation. Of course, the prerequisite was that the pressure must be within the range that one could bear. Xikongzhan was very strong and brought great pressure to Chu Mu. This was the first time that Chu Mu felt such pressure. However, Chu Mu did not collapse under this pressure. On the contrary, this pressure made him feel excited and fired up. However, before he could fight Xikongzhan, he still had to defeat the combined forces of the 13 generals. If he couldn't even defeat the combined forces of the 13 generals, how could he challenge Xikongzhan? The news that Qin Shanhe was defeated by Xikongzhan and that Chu Mu issued a challenge to Xikongzhan spread like wildfire. It became the new focus of attention once again. Ever since Chu Mu came to the Sky Edge Sword Palace, his rise had always been the center of the storm. It seemed that every major event was directly related to him. It could be said that Chu Mu was in the limelight. After watching the battle between Qin Shanhe and Xikongzhan, Chu Mu issued a challenge to Xikongzhan and quickly left to return to the sword tower. Chu Mu had gained a lot from that sword strike. He needed to immediately comprehend it and turn it into his own. He needed to increase his strength as much as possible, even if it was just a little bit. Third Revolution Sword Intent, Third Revolution Profound Meaning, Fourth Level Sword Technique Domain, Advanced Level Strength Control. This was the strength that Xikongzhan had displayed in the battle between Qin Shanhe and Xikongzhan. However, Chu Mu had a feeling that this was only the strength that he showed on the surface. Xikongzhan definitely still had some tricks up his sleeve. Even so, Xikongzhan's strength on the surface was extremely terrifying. As soon as he attacked, all of Qin Shanhe's tricks were rendered useless. Qin Shanhe could only painstakingly block each of Xikongzhan's attacks until he was defeated in the end. There's no obvious difference between me and Qin Shanhe right now. I'm not Xikongzhan's opponent at all. I still have 2 months. I need to refine my sword intent and profound meaning to the third revolution or even higher. I need to improve my other aspects as well. Only then will I be able to fight Xikongzhan and even defeat him, Chu Mu thought to himself. Then, he closed his eyes and cleared his mind of all distracting thoughts. He began to replay the battle between Qin Shanhe and Xikongzhan. Although the battle was short, there were many changes. His battle style was clearly different from the other immemorial swordsmen. It was much more profound than theirs. If one were to rank it, the battle style of the swordsmen of the ancient sword continent was the lowest level of battle. The battle style of most of the swordsmen of the immemorial world's Sky Edge Sword Palace was a level higher. In that case, Qin Shanhe's battle style was a level higher. As for Xikongzhan's battle style, it was even higher than Qin Shanhe's. Application of power. Chu Mu suddenly understood. In the immemorial world, in essence, the application of power was very important. For example, control of power was a type of application of power. Ordinary immemorial world swordsmen cultivated control of power. They would restrain their power and erupt it at the right time to form powerful attack. They would strive to heavily injure or even kill their enemies. The application of power at this level remained at the surface level. Even if one's control of power reached the advanced realm, it was still at the surface level of the application of power. Aside from cultivating the control of power, one also needed to pay attention to the infusing of power into the sword, as well as a more suitable application. For example, Sikong-jan had infused his sword intent or the profound of stars into his sword, which made the sword more powerful and unpredictable, making it harder to defend against. At first glance, this method was similar to some of the battle styles of the ancient sword continent's swordsmen. However, in reality there was a huge difference in terms of realm. It was like seeing a mountain as a mountain, then seeing a mountain as not a mountain, and then seeing a mountain as still a mountain. In short, it was very complicated and profound. It was difficult to explain it clearly with words. It was the kind of profound mystery that could only be understood but not explained. With Chu Mu's ability, he could only comprehend it, but he could not express it clearly. It was because of this that so many disciples of the Sky Edge Sword Palace were still stuck at the surface level of their battle styles. Because even if they knew, they could not comprehend it. Chu Mu was different. As his horizons were constantly broadened, with his unparalleled comprehension, he comprehended it one by one and absorbed it as his own, improving his battle style. Originally, Chu Mu had amazing battle talent. However, battle talent was like potential. If he were to cultivate behind closed doors, he would need more time to unleash it. However, when he watched the battle between powerful swordsmen, he would be stimulated. The more he comprehended and the more he saw, the more Chu Mu realized how insignificant he was. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 671. As for the matter of Chu Mu challenging Sikong-jan, after experiencing a storm of excitement, it slowly died down. It seemed that everything had returned to normal. However, everyone knew that at that time, at that place, there would be a battle waiting for them. The current calmness was only for the frenzied upheaval at that time. Qin Shanhe hadn't appeared since he was defeated by Sikong-jan's sword again. He should have stayed in his own sword tower to reflect and improve his strength. The powerful pressure was like an invisible mountain that constantly suppressed Chu Mu. It made Chu Mu feel the powerful pressure at all times. Under such pressure, Chu Mu was cultivating and improving himself at all times. He knew very well that Sikong-jan was very powerful and talented. He was many times stronger than the opponents he had encountered in the past. Even in his heart, Chu Mu didn't have much confidence that he could defeat Sikong-jan in the challenge. The time was too short. This was an extremely difficult challenge. Because of this, Chu Mu was so excited. It was a feeling that he hadn't felt for a long time. Now, he had forgotten his other goals. He just wanted to fight Sikong-jan to his heart's content. In order to be able to fight a strong opponent like Sikong-jan to his heart's content, Chu Mu needed to constantly improve his strength. He didn't stop cultivating. Chu Mu's entire body was tense. He didn't have the slightest time to rest. His brain was constantly working and never stopped. Fortunately, Chu Mu's soul was 10 times stronger than an ordinary swordsman. His mind was also very strong. Therefore, he was able to withstand the constant consumption and recovery, forming a virtuous cycle. Every day, he would refine the Sky Baron's sword origin. Then, he would cultivate sword arts and everything related on the first floor of the sword tower. After that, he would use the 9 Revolution Heaven Shocking Seal to refine his sword will and the laceration profound. His sword intent and tearing profound had both reached the 2nd revolution, and the 3rd hand imprint of the 9 Revolution Sky Shocking Seal had been successfully created as well. Chu Mu had already started the 3rd revolution of his sword intent and tearing profound. Within 2 months, he was confident that he could reach the 3rd level of his sword intent and tearing profound. As for the 4th level, there was no hope. With each revolution of the sword intent profound, the further one progressed, the more difficult it became. Chu Mu's tempering speed was already shockingly fast. These were Chu Mu's cultivation during the day. At night, Chu Mu would continue to head to the foot of Sword Observation Peak and occupy a spot to cultivate the Southern Dipper mind refining scripture. After 7 days of cultivation, Chu Mu could clearly sense the star energy of the Tianfu star. Furthermore, his ability to draw in star energy was much smoother than before. His refining efficiency had also increased. Although there was still a long way to go before he could cultivate the Tianfu star chapter, Chu Mu could feel that his consciousness had become purer under the refinement of the Tianfu star. As for the quantity of his consciousness, it hadn't increased. Chu Mu wasn't in a hurry. The Southern Dipper mind refining scripture mentioned that one must first condense all of their consciousness into a single consciousness star. Only then would the potential of their consciousness be unlocked until they were filled to the point of condensing a second consciousness star. Chu Mu still hadn't reached the standard of condensing a consciousness star, but Chu Mu wasn't in a hurry. The Southern Dipper mind refining scripture was very mysterious and far surpassed the tempering mind technique. It was only natural that his cultivation progress was slow. If it were any other swordsman, they might not even be able to reach the entry level. In the blink of an eye, time passed like water. It had been a month since Chu Mu had challenged Xikongzhan. Late at night, the foot of Sword Observation Peak was very quiet. The laws of the immemorial realm were many times more complete than those of the ancient Sword Continent. Therefore, the night in the immemorial realm was different from the night in the ancient Sword Continent. On the ancient Sword Continent, the vision of an Origin Realm swordsman wouldn't be affected by the night. However, in the immemorial realm, the vision of an Origin Realm swordsman was only slightly better than that of an ordinary person on the ancient Sword Continent. Even though Chu Mu had cultivated the sword observation technique and had vision that surpassed ordinary Origin Realm swordsmen, he could only see some vague outlines in the immemorial realm's night. Fortunately, his consciousness could still cover 100 meters. A swordsman's cultivation didn't differentiate between day and night. However, comprehending on the sword observation peak required one to be able to see the peak clearly. At this late hour, one could only see the vague outlines of the peak. How could one comprehend it? Therefore, in the surroundings of observing Sword Peak, there was only Chu Mu. Chu Mu wasn't comprehending the sword observation peak. Even with his vision, it was difficult for him to see the sword observation peak clearly in the middle of the night. He was sensing the power of the stars from the Tianfu star and guiding it into his spiritual world to refine his consciousness. After a month of cultivation, Chu Mu was already very familiar with the 2 steps of sensing and drawing upon the Heavenly Palace star's power. He could do it with ease and ease. After a month of refining, Chu Mu's consciousness had become much purer. Tonight was a very crucial night. In the middle of the night, under the guidance of Chu Mu's increasingly powerful mental intent, threads of star power that couldn't be seen with the naked eye followed an invisible line and entered Chu Mu's mental world, unceasingly cleansing and refining the intent within the mental world. More and more Heavenly Palace's star power was guided into his mental world. When it reached a certain level, Chu Mu retracted his mental remembrance and instantly cut off his connection with the Heavenly Palace's star power. In Chu Mu's spiritual world, specks of starlight twinkled like stars in the sky. It was as if this place had become a miniature version of the night sky. He withdrew his consciousness and immediately mobilized it. It spun as if a gust of wind had swept up. The wind gradually intensified and evolved into a storm, carrying specks of starlight toward the center. After a month of continuous cultivation, Chu Mu had finally cultivated the first chapter of the Southern Dipper mind refining scripture to the point where he could condense a star of consciousness. Now was the time to condense a star of consciousness. This process was very important and couldn't be interrupted. It had to be condensed in one go. Otherwise, if he gave up halfway, it would shake the spiritual world and cause a certain amount of damage. It would take a considerable amount of time to recover before it could be condensed again. That would undoubtedly waste a lot of time. Chu Mu was so focused that he completely forgot everything outside his body. He even forgot about his body. It was as if he had entered the spiritual world. The storm became stronger and stronger. Under the swirling scouring of countless starlight, the spiritual storm's consciousness became purer little by little. The speed of purification was faster than before, which surprised Chu Mu. Time slowly passed. Under the quiet sword observation peak, Chu Mu was sitting cross-legged. His spiritual world was undergoing a transformation. Rumbling sounds echoed in the spiritual world. The momentum was as powerful as 10,000 galloping horses. It was earth-shattering and extremely shocking. As the spiritual storm continued to spin and shrink, Chu Mu felt a terrifying pressure coming from it, squeezing the barrier of the spiritual world. Fortunately, his spiritual world was strong and stable enough to resist the pressure. However, the pressure grew stronger and stronger. Gradually, Chu Mu seemed to hear the spiritual world creaking. It was as if it was on the verge of collapse and could be crushed by the increasingly powerful pressure at any time. When the pressure increased to the extreme, Chu Mu was a little worried that the barrier of the spiritual world would be able to withstand the continuous impact of the pressure. However, this was the last moment, the most critical moment. The spiritual storm had been compressed and condensed to the extreme, turning into a small vortex that spun crazily at an extremely high speed. All the starlight gathered in it. It looked as if countless sparks were colliding in it and were about to splash out. It was incomparably dazzling. Condense. In the spiritual world, Chu Mu's stern shout sounded. It was full of power as if it was the dignified order of a high and mighty god. In an instant, the vortex of spiritual thoughts collapsed again. Condense! 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 Every time it condensed, Chu Mu would feel his spiritual world shake. The pressure that had been increased to the extreme seemed to have increased again, attacking the barrier of the spiritual world. It felt as if a feather was crushing Mount Tai. At this time, it was either success or death. There was no possibility of retreat. Condense, condense, condense. 3 condenses in a row, almost superimposed on each other. The spiritual storm that had almost collapsed to the extreme suddenly trembled and collapsed again, almost condensing into a solid. Then, it trembled violently as if it was about to explode. Chu Mu hurriedly suppressed it with his powerful will, causing the spiritual storm that seemed to be about to explode to tremble continuously. Chu Mu was not in the mood to care about the pressure on the barrier of the spiritual world. At this time, only by completely condensing his spiritual thoughts could he save himself from the crisis at this time. The pressure of the life and death crisis gave Chu Mu a huge motivation. His powerful will erupted and suppressed the spiritual storm once again, crazily crushing it. Condense. A voice that seemed to resound through the heavens and earth once again rang out in the mental world. The terrifying pressure that was like an unending tide instantly paused. The mental intense storm that had almost collapsed to the limit and was about to explode abruptly trembled. All resistance was shattered by Chu Mu's willpower. The spiritual storm collapsed again, and a series of explosions came from within. The explosions caused Chu Mu's will to tremble violently and almost shatter. His consciousness also fell into a temporary darkness in an instant. It was only 1/100th of a second, but it felt as long as 10 years. When Chu Mu woke up, he suddenly realized that the enormous pressure in the spiritual world had disappeared. His spiritual world, under unknown circumstances, had more than doubled in stability. Most importantly, Chu Mu saw a star floating in the sky above his spiritual world, emitting a faint starlight. That star was the concentration of all his spiritual thoughts. After sensing it carefully, Chu Mu could feel that the spiritual thoughts contained in that star were extremely tyrannical and terrifying. The appearance of the star meant that Chu Mu had completed the first part of the cultivation of the Southern Dipper mind refining scripture. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Qidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 672. There was no light in the middle of the night. Under the empty sword observation peak, a cold wind blew and whistled. At such a late hour, the temperature had dropped to a level that ordinary people could not bear. Even with Chu Mu's physique, he couldn't help but feel a little cold. However, at this moment, his heart was burning. What pure spiritual consciousness! Chu Mu exclaimed in a low voice. Only he could hear his voice. In the spiritual world, there was a flickering consciousness star floating in the sky. It was a miniature of the Tianfu star, an ancient star. Inside it was the collection of all of Chu Mu's spiritual consciousness. The spiritual consciousness in the consciousness star was twice as pure as before. In other words, Chu Mu's spiritual strength had increased by 2 times. This was a very terrifying increase. The higher the strength of the spiritual consciousness, the easier it would be to use it. The degree of control over one's own strength would also be further deepened. In short, there was no limit to it. The Tianfu Star chapter has been completed. I can't cultivate the second chapter, the Tianliang Star chapter, for the time being. The reason was very simple. The cultivation of each chapter of the Southern Dipper mind refining scripture required all the spiritual consciousness in the spiritual world to be tempered with the corresponding power of the stars. Then, with enough power of the stars, the spiritual consciousness would be condensed into a consciousness star. The previous spiritual consciousness had already been condensed into a miniature consciousness star of the Tianfu star. The new spiritual consciousness flowed out naturally like a stream and appeared in the spiritual world. That was the development of the potential of the spiritual consciousness. The speed at which his potential was developed wasn't fast, but it was continuous. Now that a period of time had passed, his mental world had an additional sliver of mental intent. Chu Mu felt it slightly and knew that these mental intents were the most primitive mental intent. In other words, they were mental intents that had never been refined. Chu Mu estimated that at this speed of development, it would be very difficult to fill the empty spiritual world with spiritual consciousness again. It would take at least half a year. However, the current spiritual consciousness is enough to deal with everything. At this time, the sky was gradually brightening. There were already swordsmen here. They took up positions and prepared to comprehend the sword observation peak. Chu Mu got up and left, returning to the sword tower. As soon as he entered the sword gauntlet, Chu Mu drew his sword and started practicing his sword skills. He still started from the most primitive basic sword technique and went through it again and again until he reached the most profound basic sword technique that he had grasped so far. Every cycle was a journey, a miniature version. Among them, Chu Mu also practiced strength control, swordsmanship domain, mountain quake force, and so on. However, the feeling of practicing swordsmanship today was completely different from before. The feeling of having everything under control made Chu Mu intoxicated. With a slash of his sword, the mountain-shaking energy was activated. The 8 desolate sky swords vibrated at a high frequency. It was impossible to see with the naked eye, and even the sound could not be heard. This was because the vibrations had already reached an extreme speed. This strike was purely infused with the mountain trembling force, without the use of sword intent or sword origin. As the sword slashed down, the space seemed to be split open, leaving a large faint mark. Chu Mu suddenly withdrew his sword and stared at the faint white mark in the air in a daze. It was not until the white mark dissipated that he came to his senses. This feeling, Chu Mu muttered to himself. His various understandings of fighting naturally flashed through his mind. At the beginning, he was unfamiliar with it, then he became proficient at it. Then he left the ancient sword continent and entered the sky-edge sword palace in the Archean world. Here, he saw new fighting methods and gradually improved from the lowest level. A flash of inspiration appeared in his mind. It was as if a sword light had cut through the darkness. The world became transparent and bright, and a path paved with starlight appeared in front of him. Chu Mu immediately sat down cross-legged, focused his mind, closed his eyes, and began to comprehend on the spot. In his mind, various thoughts flashed like flowing light, faster and faster. Finally, they fixed on a few scenes and spun rapidly. All kinds of understandings appeared in his mind. Unknowingly, Chu Mu's understanding of the mountain trembling force deepened to another level. Although the mountain trembling force was the essence of the Zhen Tian school, it had long been lost. There was only the most basic cultivation method of the trembling force, and the rest were just some simple records. Being able to master the mountain trembling force was entirely due to Chu Mu's own foundation and knowledge, as well as his strong comprehension ability. However, no matter how strong Chu Mu's comprehension ability was, it was not omnipotent. The world of the sword was so vast and boundless. No matter how great a person's strength was, there would be a time when it was limited. Therefore, relying on one's own comprehension and hard work could only be one-sided and incomplete. Only through practice, battle, observation, comprehension, and absorption could one continuously perfect it. If Chu Mu was still in the ancient sword continent, he might still be able to achieve good results, but it would be difficult for him to reach the true nirvana realm of the sword way. Entering the Archean world could be said to be the biggest turning point in Chu Mu's life. When he opened his eyes, two beams of light shot out, and the air in front of him seemed to vibrate. Chu Mu quickly got up, drew his sword, and slashed out. The mountain trembling force was activated, and a faint white trace appeared in the air. The trace was very fine, straight, and delicate, as if it was made by nature. After a full 3 breaths, the white trace faded and then disappeared. I see. Although I comprehended the mountain trembling force before, it was not profound enough and was not perfect enough. It was still on the surface level. Chu Mu said to himself, "The improvement of the strength of my spiritual will has further enhanced my control of my own strength. Only then can I perfect the mountain trembling force with the same strength of my body and truly develop its potential." The sword just now was only integrated with the pure mountain trembling force, and its power was obviously more than twice as strong as before. This meant that the mountain trembling force still had potential to be developed. Chu Mu continued to practice and study for more than an hour. The power of the mountain trembling force had indeed improved, but it had reached the limit. Unless the strength of my spiritual will can be improved again. Thinking about it, Chu Mu shook his head. That was a very difficult thing. Chu Mu's spiritual will was originally much purer than that of ordinary swordsmen, at least twice as strong. Then, after practicing the mind-tempering skill and drinking the teacher-in-chief's miraculous wine, it doubled again. Now, after practicing the Southern Dipper mind-refining scripture, it doubled again. His spiritual will had reached a shocking level of purity. Even if he condensed the second mind star, it would only increase his spiritual will, but not the strength of his spiritual will. Unless he mastered all 6 chapters of the Southern Dipper mind-refining scripture, and then used the 6 mind stars to resonate with the power of the Archean stars to carry out the final refinement. Undoubtedly, that would take a long time. Therefore, the current mountain trembling force had really reached the limit in terms of strength. The ultimate mountain trembling force was more powerful than the level 3 basic profound meaning. Chu Mu's attack power had been further improved. Next, Chu Mu continued to practice. Not only did he use the mountain trembling force, but he also integrated the sword origin, sword intent, and mountain trembling force into the sword. The power of that sword strike shocked even Chu Mu. After that, Chu Mu tried to control the power in a deeper level. In an instant, the sword origin, sword intent, and mountain trembling force burst out. The force penetrated the sword tip and pierced the void. A tiny black spot appeared in the air, and wisps of strange power came out of the black spot. It lasted for a full 10 breaths before dissipating. Practicing the control of power suddenly inspired Chu Mu. Since the control of power had reached a deeper level, He could condense and control all the power in a certain place or even a certain point. Then, could he also control the mountain trembling force on the sword blade? As soon as he thought of it, Chu Mu immediately shook his wrist and tried to infuse the mountain trembling force into the sword. He controlled the mountain trembling force to only converge on the sword blade. In a sword, only the sword blade, the sword edge, and the sword tip had the real lethality. Everything else was used as support in order to kill the target. After several attempts, Chu Mu successfully controlled the mountain trembling force on the sword blade with his extremely powerful mind. The sword blade did not move, but the sword blade vibrated at a very high frequency. It was so fast that even Chu Mu's mind could not distinguish it. It was only vaguely visible that at the edge of the eight-sided Tianhuang sword, there seemed to be white marks in the air. They quickly dissipated and reappeared. In this state, Chu Mu began to practice swordsmanship. The power of each sword strike became very terrifying. Gradually, Chu Mu integrated the way of controlling power into it. The mountain trembling force began to become faintly discernible. It would only be unleashed when it hit an imaginary target. This method has increased the lethality of the mountain trembling force by a lot. It also saves more energy consumption. With the current strength of my body, it can be easily used. Southern Dipper mind refining scripture. I made the right choice. Chu Mu sighed. Before this, he did not know that cultivating the Southern Dipper mind refining scripture and condensing a mind star would greatly increase the strength of his mind. It would also significantly improve the mountain trembling force. Suddenly, Chu Mu's eyes lit up. An idea flashed through his mind unconsciously. It seemed to be related to the limit entry. He closed his eyes, eliminated all distracting thoughts, and thought carefully. After standing for a full hour, Chu Mu opened his eyes and exhaled with a slight regret. The limit entry is more profound than the deep entry. Fortunately, I have found the direction. As long as I work hard in this direction, I will definitely reach the limit entry level. After finishing his swordsmanship practice, Chu Mu walked up to the second floor of the sword tower. He returned to his bedroom and sat cross-legged on the bed. He first sorted out what he had learned today, sorted out his thoughts, and made a new plan for his future. Then, he began to condense the third hand gesture of the 9-revolution heavenly heart-shocking seal. Together with the corresponding mental cultivation method, he used his mind to refine the sword intent. As soon as he refined it, Chu Mu felt the difference. After the strength of his mind was doubled, the effect of his mind refining also increased greatly. In this way, Chu Mu was confident that he could refine the sword intent and the laceration profound to the third revolution in the following period of time. At that time, his strength would be further improved. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 673. It had been 1.5 months since Chu Mu challenged Xikongzhan. Today, Chu Mu finally succeeded in refining the ripping profound to the third revolution. As for the fourth hand seal of the 9-revolution heavenly shocking palm technique, he had yet to finish studying it. There's still half a month. Before that, I'll go do something first, Chu Mu thought to himself. He left the sword tower and headed to the puppet sword array area again. There was no doubt that the puppet sword array was a good place to test one's strength and earn sky edge coins. Chu Mu's whereabouts were closely followed. As soon as he headed to the puppet sword array area, he was immediately watched by many pairs of eyes. The news spread like a storm. When Chu Mu entered the puppet sword array area, there was already a large number of swordsmen gathered here. This scene was not as big as Xikongzhan's, but it was not far off. This also showed that Chu Mu's popularity among the official disciples of the Sky Edge Sword Palace was on the verge of catching up to Xikongzhan. What do you think Chu Mu is doing here? Isn't that obvious? Of course it's to challenge the puppet sword array. Chu Mu has only come here a few times. Each time, he has challenged the puppet sword formation. Moreover, each time, he has improved and his strength has clearly increased. Could it be that this time, his strength has increased by leaps and bounds again? Impossible. Chu Mu already passed the 7th stage of the puppet sword array last time. Even Sikong Zhan only passed the 8th stage. Could it be that Chu Mu still wants to pass the 8th stage? If Chu Mu really passes the 8th stage of the puppet sword array, the swordsmen were suddenly speechless. If Chu Mu really passed the 8th stage of the puppet sword array, didn't that mean that Chu Mu really had the strength to contend with Sikong Zhan? Thinking of this, the swordsman could not help but feel excited. The crowd automatically dispersed as if welcoming the arrival of a king. Chu Mu followed the passage and walked towards the puppet sword array. He entered and began to challenge the array. The first stage was the yin and yang sword formation. Chu Mu's approach was different from Sikong Zhan's. He was not in a hurry to break the formation. Standing in the yin and yang sword formation, Chu Mu dodged the attacks of the yin and yang sword puppets with ease. However, the swordsmen watching from the outside were baffled. They did not know what Chu Mu was up to. What they didn't know was that after Chu Mu condensed a mind star, the strength of his mental power had doubled. Although the coverage was still 100 meters, everything within 100 meters had become more detailed. Furthermore, Chu Mu's observation ability, comprehension ability, integration ability, and other aspects had also improved greatly due to the improvement of his mental strength. It was this improvement that allowed him to deepen his understanding of the sword formation. Not long after, Chu Mu's understanding of the yin and yang sword formation deepened by another level. He didn't even draw his sword. Instead, he put his left index and middle fingers together to form a sword and pointed at the body of the dual polarity sword puppet sword. Activating the mountain-shaking energy, he instantly broke the sword. His sword finger followed the momentum and pierced through the sword puppet's forehead, destroying it. The extreme power of the mountain-shaking energy was terrifyingly tyrannical. Even the sword puppet's tough body could not withstand it. The power of Chu Mu's sword finger was not inferior to a royal-grade sword in the slightest. Entering the 2nd stage of the puppet sword formation, the tripartite sword formation, Chu Mu dodged first and further comprehended the mysteries of the tripartite sword formation. When he reached the limit, he attacked and still used his sword finger to destroy the tripartite sword puppet. The 4 symbols sword formation was also destroyed by Chu Mu's sword finger after he deepened his understanding. Passing through 3 sword formations without using his sword was enough to show that Chu Mu's strength had increased significantly compared to before. Think about it, among the official disciples of the Sky Edge Sword Palace, perhaps only Sikong Zhan and Chu Mu had achieved the 3rd revolution of sword intent and the 3rd revolution of the profound meaning. One must know that there were as many as 2 million official disciples in the Sky Edge Sword Palace. Among the 2 million swordsmen, there were only 2 who had reached the 3rd revolution of sword intent and the profound meaning. It was 1 in a million. Moreover, Chu Mu also possessed the mountain-shaking energy that had reached the limit. Its power was not inferior to the profound meaning of sword intent in the slightest. The 3 sword fingers combined had terrifying destructive power. The 5 elements sword puppet was also defeated by Chu Mu's sword finger. Puppet sword formation's 5th stage, hexagonal sword formation. The swordsmen watching outside were dumbfounded. What did they see? Chu Mu actually did not use his sword and only used his sword finger to consecutively pass through 4 stages of the puppet sword formation and enter the 5th stage. What was sword finger? All swordsmen knew. Such a simple sword finger actually possessed such terrifying power. However, the 5th stage of the puppet sword formation, the hexagonal sword formation, was not something that Chu Mu could pass without using his sword. But Chu Mu still dodged very easily. After comprehending the hexagonal sword formation to a certain extent, the 8 desolate sky swords were unsheathed. Sword light flickered and the hexagonal sword puppets were defeated. This was much easier than the previous time. Puppet sword formation's 6th stage. 7 stars sword formation. Passed. Puppet sword formation's 7th stage. 8-fold sword formation. Last time, this stage was Chu Mu's final point and also his limit. But this time, Chu Mu's sword intent and ripping profound meaning had both advanced by 1 revolution. His mountain-shaking energy's power had also increased by several fold. His overall strength had also increased by several fold. The immense pressure of the 8-fold sword formation was unable to affect Chu Mu much. After comprehending the 8-fold sword formation's mysteries, Chu Mu immediately understood. Then, he attacked again, looking for flaws and defeating the 8-fold sword puppets one by one, successfully passing through the 8-fold sword formation. Puppet sword formation's 8th stage. 9 revolutions sword formation. To date, the highest record for an official disciple of the Sky Edge Sword Palace to pass through the puppet sword formation was the 8th stage, the 9 revolutions sword formation. Moreover, since the establishment of the Sky Edge Sword Palace, there were very, very few swordsmen who could pass through the 9 revolutions sword formation. There were no more than 100 people. The 9 revolutions sword formation had 9 sword puppet. When the formation was activated, the 9 sword puppets immediately moved and attacked with their sword. The pressure of the 9 revolutions sword formation was several times stronger than that of the 8-fold sword formation. It crushed Chu Mu's body, almost suffocating him. Moreover, the pressure of the 9 revolutions sword formation also targeted the spiritual level. If Chu Mu had not condensed a willpower star, he would not have been able to last long under the impact of this pressure. Most importantly, the pressure of the 9 revolutions sword formation, as its name suggested, had 9 revolutions. Every time it revolved, the pressure was like a millstone that removed Chu Mu's resistance. However, Chu Mu felt that the pressure was constantly increasing. Chu Mu was in a terrible situation as he had to resist this powerful and terrifying pressure while also dodging the attacks of the 9 revolutions sword puppet. The swordsmen outside all held their breaths as they stared at Chu Mu. They subconsciously clenched their fists. From the bottom of their hearts, they hoped that Chu Mu could pass through the 9 revolutions sword formation. The sword puppets of the 9 revolutions sword formation were much stronger than the sword puppets of other sword formations. The sword intent and profound power they contained was very pure, and all of them had reached the first revolution. With the cooperation of the sword formation, their power increased several times and became even more terrifying. Moreover, the cooperation between them made it so that Chu Mu could not find the slightest flaw. It was flawless. Every attack was a spin. Every spin was like an enormous millstone crushing down on Chu Mu, causing him to be exhausted from dealing with it. Chu Mu finally knew how terrifying Sikong Zhan was. He was able to persevere in the 9 revolution sword formation and ultimately defeat it without seeming to have suffered any injuries. Only after experiencing it personally did he understand how terrifying the 9 revolutions sword formation was. The pressure is too great. I can't last much longer here. I have to break the formation as soon as possible, Chu Mu secretly said. He clenched his teeth and prepared himself to be injured. In an instant, all of his strength erupted as he used Profound Realm. With one sword, he immediately broke the 9 revolutions sword puppet's sword. Immediately after, he used Profound Realm to kill another sword puppet. The 9 revolutions sword formation brought too much pressure to Chu Mu. The power of Profound Realm was not enough to contend against it. Fortunately, Chu Mu had already cultivated Profound Realm to the extreme and could use it 7 times in a row. At the same time, a sword slashed across Chu Mu's back. He tried his best to dodge, but he still felt a burst of cold pain. Chu Mu knew that he had been hit. Fortunately, the wound was not deep. After 7 consecutive bursts of Profound Realm sword, He immediately destroyed 7 sword puppet. Chu Mu instantly felt out of breath. He resisted this feeling and barely dodged, but another wound appeared on his arm. 1 breath of time was enough for Chu Mu to catch his breath. He fought with the remaining 2 sword puppets and took the opportunity to recover. It was a fierce battle, an extremely difficult battle. Chu Mu really wanted to stop, but victory was right in front of him. As long as he defeated the remaining 2 sword puppets, he would be able to break through the 9 revolutions sword formation. The 9 revolutions sword formation only had 2 sword puppets left. Its power was greatly reduced, and the pressure was greatly reduced. However, Chu Mu's strength was also greatly reduced. The surrounding swordsmen all looked nervous as they cheered for Chu Mu. After half an hour, Chu Mu felt that his strength had recovered a bit. He once again burst out and destroyed a sword puppet. The remaining sword puppet did not have any buffs and was also defeated by Chu Mu's counterattack. He passed. Chu Mu passed the 9 revolutions sword formation. The surrounding swordsmen were even more excited than Chu Mu. Chu Mu was not in a hurry to leave the 9 revolutions sword formation. Instead, he stood there quietly and allowed his strength to recover. After a while, he recovered a bit and could move normally, then he walked out of the sword formation. Although his robe was torn and there were 3 wounds on his body, the swordsman looked at Chu Mu with eyes full of reverence. 9 revolutions sword formation. Chu Mu was the second person they saw to pass the 9 revolutions sword formation. No matter what, it still shocked them. One could imagine what kind of commotion it would cause once the news of Chu Mu passing the 9 revolutions sword formation spread out. What made people look forward to even more was that there was only half a month left before the battle between Chu Mu and Xikongzhan. At that time, how exciting would their battle be? On the contrary, Chu Mu did not feel excited. Instead, he felt tired. He rarely experienced this kind of feeling. This time, it was brought to him by the 9 revolutions sword formation. He only had one thought now, and that was to rest. He wanted to have a good rest. It would be best if he could have a good sleep and not think about anything. He wanted to let go of everything and have a good sleep. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 674. Chu Mu passed the 8th level of the puppet sword formation. Xikongzhan's indifferent face revealed a trace of a smile, as if he had found something fun. Yes, but he was injured in 3 places when he passed the 9 revolution sword formation. He is obviously not as good as Lord Fei Kong said. Don't underestimate him. He grew up in a worse environment than us. Once he came here, his strength increased by leaps and bounds. To be able to reach this step in such a short time, he is indeed very capable. Xikongzhan recovered his indifference and said slowly, half a month later, bring out your full strength to fight him. Yes, Lord. We will definitely defeat Chu Mu. Fei Kong said. This kid's growth speed is beyond my imagination. He actually passed the 8th level of the puppet sword formation. After Ji Tianxiang heard the news, he pondered for a moment before smiling with a trace of expectation. I wonder if he can pass the last level of the puppet sword formation before becoming an elite disciple? Chu Mu didn't know about everyone's expectations and discussions. He quickly returned to the sword tower with the 6,000 sky edge coins he obtained from the puppet sword formation. He closed the door of his room and immediately fell asleep on the bed. Too tired, too exhausted. On one hand, he had continuously cultivated without rest for several months. Although Chu Mu didn't feel tired, it was like a taut bowstring. Then, he had broken through the puppet sword formation's 8th stage, the 9 revolution sword formation. The pressure was too great, causing Chu Mu's strength to be completely exhausted, and he was even injured. All of the accumulated exhaustion exploded out like a mountain flood breaking through a dam. It was as if he had returned to the time when he was a fetus. He didn't have to think about anything. It was as if he was in a hot spring. After sleeping for an entire day, Chu Mu naturally woke up. Stretching his limbs, cracking sounds came from his body. His entire body felt comfortable and refreshed. Chu Mu was intoxicated by the feeling of being reborn. It seemed like it had been a long time since he had experienced such a comfortable feeling. It turned out that after a deep exhaustion, letting go of everything and having a good sleep was so wonderful. With a thought, it instantly spread throughout his body. Chu Mu carefully sensed that every part of his body was brimming with vitality. It was as if a drought had been met with a sweet rain, a vitality that sprouted like bamboo shoots after the rain. All the accumulated fatigue in his body was swept away. Immediately after, Chu Mu's eyes widened and he revealed an astonished expression. "I can't believe he's developed so much of his spiritual will." The potential of his mental remembrance was slowly being developed at an even pace. However, Chu Mu discovered that after sleeping, without him knowing, his mental remembrance had suddenly increased by a lot. Its development speed was at least 3 times faster than usual. Since his condition was better than ever, Chu Mu didn't waste any time. He went downstairs and began cultivating once more. In another 14 days, it would be the day he challenged Sikongjian. Comparing the process of both of them challenging the 9 revolutions sword formation, Chu Mu knew that there was still an obvious gap between him and Sikongjian. It was obviously impossible for him to temper his sword intent and profound to the 4th revolution in just a dozen days. He hadn't even finished studying the 4th hand seal yet. Therefore, Chu Mu could only strengthen other aspects, such as improving his fighting style, increasing the power of his sword, his footwork, and other aspects. He wanted to improve as much as possible. For the next 14 days, Chu Mu didn't leave his room. He was completely immersed in high-intensity cultivation. However, because the potential of his spiritual consciousness was still being developed, he didn't need to cultivate the Southern Dipper mind refining scripture. Therefore, Chu Mu took out 4 hours of his night to sleep. He discovered that when he slept for 4 hours, the potential of his spiritual consciousness would be developed twice as fast. Although it wasn't as fast as before, it was still much faster. The time it took for his spiritual consciousness to fill his spiritual world was greatly reduced. In the official disciple area of the Sky Edge Sword Palace, a large number of swordsmen had gathered at the first arena. They were densely packed and impenetrable. In one area, there was a large group of swordsmen with small bronze swords embroidered on their chests standing together. The group seemed very orderly. Some of the swordsmen were even holding large signs with the words "Grand Elder, Unparalleled Might" written on them. These swordsmen were members of the Ancient Sword Union. Chu Mu, the Grand Elder, had become the focus of attention time and time again. He had done things that ordinary swordsmen couldn't do. Even now, he could still be mentioned in the same breath as the #1 official disciple, Sikongjian. He had long since become the idol of the Ancient Sword Union's swordsmen. The first time might be an accident, the second time might be a miracle, but the third time was something that people couldn't help but take seriously. The first time, the third time, the fourth time, the fifth time, the sixth time, that was true strength. Perhaps the current Chu Mu wasn't as good as Sikongjian, but in the hearts of all the swordsmen of the Ancient Sword Union, Chu Mu was the strongest. Considering all the factors, the fact that Chu Mu could reach this step in such a short period of time meant that as long as Chu Mu was given enough time, they believed that Chu Mu would definitely surpass Sikongjian. No matter what, the Ancient Sword Union had already been branded with Chu Mu's label. As long as Chu Mu was willing, with a single command, almost all the swordsmen of the Ancient Sword Union would obey Chu Mu's orders. Even Su Haoshao, the Union Master, couldn't compare to such prestige. After all, the Ancient Sword Union could only be established so smoothly because Chu Mu was the Grand Elder. Fortunately, Chu Mu didn't have any thoughts about power. He also didn't like to be a manager. Su Haoshao also understood this point, which was why he invited Chu Mu to be the Grand Elder without any worries. Now was the day of the battle between Chu Mu and Xikongzhan. Almost all the swordsmen of the ancient sword union were present. There were no less than 6,000 of them. Among the official disciples, they could be considered the largest force. 13 figures quickly rushed over from the distance. They leaped into the air and used their movement techniques to fly over the heads of many swordsmen. They landed on the stage one after another. They were the 13 generals under Xikongzhan. A sharp aura rose from the 13 generals and permeated the surroundings. Each of their eyes emitted a sharp light as traces of battle intent wrapped around their bodies. They were like treasured swords that were about to be unsheathed. However, Xikongzhan didn't appear. Chu Mu, why haven't you shown yourself yet? Could it be that you're afraid? The 6th general shouted. His voice was like rolling thunder as it rolled across the stage. Bullshit, why would the Grand Elder be afraid of you guys? That's right. With just the few of you, how could you be a match for the Grand Elder? The words of the 6th general infuriated the swordsmen of the ancient sword union. They all glared at the 13 generals and roared. Even if their individual strength was not as great as the 13 generals, the fury of several thousand swordsmen was not something to be scoffed at. It caused the expressions of the 13 generals to change slightly. There was a slight sound of wind breaking as a white figure flew across the sky above the swordsmen. It was as light as a swan as it landed on the stage in the blink of an eye. Where's Xikongzhan? Chu Mu glanced over and asked Fei Kong. Lord Xikongzhan is not someone you can meet just because you want to, the 6th general said with an enigmatic smile. Defeat the 13 of us together first, said Fei Kong. As soon as he finished speaking, his figure flapped and the sound of wind breaking rang out. In the blink of an eye, the 13 generals spread out and stood in their positions, surrounding Chu Mu. Sword formation. Looking at the positions of the 13 generals, Chu Mu had a mysterious feeling. He frowned slightly. Among the 13 generals, Fei Kang's sword intent and profundity had both reached the second revolution. The other generals' sword intent and profundity had basically reached the first revolution, but there was a difference in depth. When the 13 generals worked together, an ordinary third revolution sword practitioner might not be a match for them, let alone a sword formation. Moreover, Chu Mu did not know what kind of sword formation the 13 generals were setting up. The reason he could tell it was a sword formation was because he had broken through the puppet sword formation several times and had a much deeper understanding of sword formations. In short, any sword formation could not be underestimated. Moreover, it was a sword formation set up by the 13 generals. Chu Mu attached great importance to it. This sword formation is called the Flood Dragon Sword Formation. You have to break it and defeat all of us to win, shouted Fei Kong. Flood Dragon Sword Formation. The 13 generals actually set up a sword formation. Most swordsmen had not studied sword formations, so they could not tell that it was a sword formation. When they heard Fei Kang's words, they were all shocked. In their opinion, the 13 generals were very powerful. When they worked together, they were even more terrifying. Now that they had set up a sword formation, their power had multiplied. Chu Mu's situation was not good. The Flood Dragon Sword Formation had not yet been activated, but it had already emitted traces of pressure that washed over him. Flood Dragon Sword Formation. Chu Mu was deep in thought. Every sword formation had a name. This name was not given casually. Swordsmen who had studied sword formations would often be able to make some connections from the name of the sword formation. Chu Mu had broken through the puppet sword formation several times and was quite knowledgeable about basic sword formations. Therefore, after thinking about it, he had a better understanding of the Flood Dragon sword formation. However, whether it was true or not, he still needed to personally experience it. Chu Mu, the sword formation is about to be activated, Fei Kong reminded. At the same time, he was also giving orders to the other generals. Immediately, the 13 generals drew their swords. An incomparably sharp aura was emitted from their swords. The sword pressure descended and directly attacked Chu Mu. It was as if they wanted to cut Chu Mu into pieces. "Flood dragon out of the sea!" Fei Kong shouted. The sword formation suddenly changed. The 13 generals seemed to have merged into one and turned into a flood dragon. With Fei Kong as the dragon head and the 13th general as the dragon tail, it swam like a flood dragon out of the sea. Fei Kong attacked Chu Mu with his sword. This sword had merged the sharpness of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th generals into one. Its power was multiplied several times as it pierced towards Chu Mu. In an instant, Chu Mu was locked in by a powerful aura. It was as if he saw a huge flood dragon head rushing out of the water and biting at him. Its power was unparalleled. Using the flying swan illusory steps, Chu Mu's body became unstable. He instantly dodged Fei Kang's sword. "Flood dragon flip!" Fei Kong shouted again. The flood dragon sword formation changed and instantly surrounded Chu Mu in an arc. It reduced the space that Chu Mu could dodge as much as possible. The 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th generals attacked one after another. Each sword carried a terrifying power and slashed towards Chu Mu from the bottom to the top. It looked like a flood dragon flipping its body. Each sword was different from the beginning and the end, and the timing was very accurate. It was like a meat grinder. Chu Mu, who was trapped in the middle, was about to be ground to death. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 675. Below the arena, the swordsmen all cried out in alarm. In that instant, it was too dangerous. In their eyes, Chu Mu had no room to dodge at all because his surroundings were sealed off by the swords of the generals. It was as if he was surrounded by a flood dragon. The flood dragon sword array was a powerful sword array. The 13 generals had been immersed in the flood dragon sword array for several years and were already familiar with it. They could fully display its power. Chu Mu is about to lose. Some swordsmen's hearts jumped. Would Chu Mu lose just like that? The answer was no, because Chu Mu was often synonymous with miracles. He could turn the impossible into the possible. Using the inverted air step, Chu Mu's figure flashed and disappeared. The 3 swords slashed through the air at the same time, but they all missed. Flood dragons soaring clouds. Fei Kang's expression changed as he hurriedly shouted. The 13 generals immediately shifted their positions and changed their formation. They formed a circle, as if they were a white cloud, and took a defensive stance. Chu Mu's figure strangely appeared outside the flood dragon sword array. He unsheathed his sword and slashed out at an extremely fast speed. However, the 4th, 5th, and 6th generals worked together to block it. The advantage of the flood dragon sword array was that every attack could gather the power of multiple swordsmen, or allow multiple swordsmen to form a defensive barrier at the same time, maximizing the weakening power of the attack. Chu Mu's sword was very powerful. He had used the elementary realm, but under the flood dragon sword array of the 13 generals, it was scattered and could hardly cause any damage. Flood dragon swings its tail. Fei Kong shouted again. In that instant, the 11th, 12th, and 13th generals seemed to merge into one. They all slashed at Chu Mu. Chu Mu seemed to see the flood dragon's tail fiercely swinging at him like a thick steel whip. Among all the attacks of the flood dragon sword array, the flood dragon swings its tail was the weakest. However, it still gathered the power of the 3 generals and won in terms of flexibility. Head to tail. Fei Kong ordered again. His feet moved in an arc, and his long sword pierced towards Chu Mu. In the eyes of the spectating swordsman, it was as if a flood dragon's tail was slapping towards Chu Mu. At the same time, its head was also rushing towards Chu Mu, opening its mouth to bite him. At the same time, Chu Mu had to endure the attacks from both the head and tail of the flood dragon. The boundless pressure was like a mountain of swords pressing down on Chu Mu, causing him to be unable to breathe. Even moving required a great deal of effort. In order to avoid the flood dragon's attack, Chu Mu had used the inverted space steps that he hadn't used for a long time. However, he had only comprehended 40% of the profound meaning of space. The space of the primeval world was many times stronger than that of the ancient sword continent. Using the inverted space steps once consumed 70% of Chu Mu's strength. In other words, he couldn't use the inverted space steps anymore. His entire body's strength erupted, and his mental energy reached a high level. His eyes emitted a sharp and cold light as Chu Mu pushed the Flying Swan illusory space steps to the extreme. The Flying Swan illusory space steps that had been infused with the profound meaning of tearing added a sharp aura to it. Chu Mu's body was like a sharp sword, instantly cutting through the layers of pressure. Instead of retreating, he advanced and cut into the Flood Dragon sword array. The 8 desolate sky swords were like meteors falling from the sky as they pierced towards the 8th general. Not good. Fei Kang's expression greatly changed, and so did the 8th general's. Chu Mu's actions were completely out of their expectations. At this moment, the Flood Dragon sword array was in the middle of the Flood Dragon's swinging tail and head and tail linking. There was no time to change it. They could only hope that the 8th general could block Chu Mu's sword and buy them a chance to change the sword array. Although he didn't understand the Flood Dragon sword array, Chu Mu had broken through the sword puppet array many times, so he had a clear understanding of sword arrays. Based on his intuition, Chu Mu knew that this sword was his chance. If he missed it, it would be very difficult to get another chance. Therefore, this sword was the strongest. It was a soundless sword strike, a sword strike that was like flowing light. The 7th and 9th generals were beside the 8th general. They quickly attacked Chu Mu with their swords, hoping that Chu Mu would withdraw his sword and give up on attacking. The 8th general was not to be outdone. He slashed out with his sword, and within 2 inches, all of his strength exploded out, causing the wind and thunder to explode. They were very clear that no matter what, they had to block Chu Mu's sword and stop him from returning empty-handed. Chu Mu's wrist shook, and the sword that he stabbed out instantly vibrated. In 1,000th of a second, the swords of the 7th and 9th generals were repelled by the mountain-quaking energy. The 8 desolate sky swords borrowed the rebounding force and stabbed at the 8th general at an even faster speed. The 8th general's expression greatly changed. But Chu Mu's sword was too fast. It was so fast that his vision couldn't keep up. He only felt his wrist shake, and his sword seemed to have been repelled. Immediately after, a tyrannical force pierced through his protective sword aura. An even more terrifying force condensed into a single point and instantly pierced his chest. Burst. The 8th general felt as if his heart had been pierced by a sword. There was a burst of intense pain. This pain caused his vision to darken. He swayed and subconsciously took 2 steps back. He raised his head and spat out a mouthful of blood. His body fell backward. Immediately, the Flood Dragon sword formation revealed a flaw. In a spurt of energy, Chu Mu once again attacked. Sword light streaked across the sky, and the 7th and 9th generals were instantly sent flying. The swords in their hands were cut in half and flew high into the air. The Flood Dragon sword formation had been broken. There wasn't much energy left in his body. Chu Mu didn't dare to delay. He once again burst out. In the blink of an eye, another 4 generals were sent flying by Chu Mu's sword. 7 of the 13 generals had been defeated. There were only 6 left. His figure flashed, and he quickly moved around the battle arena. Chu Mu took this opportunity to catch his breath. In half a month, he had become more proficient in deep penetration. He was able to unleash 8 bursts of energy in a spurt of energy. Now that he had unleashed 7 bursts of energy, Chu Mu wouldn't fall into an embarrassing situation of instant exhaustion. Moreover, he could quickly recover and adjust. Fei Kong swept a glance and knew that they had lost their advantage. It was unlikely that the remaining 6 people would be able to defeat Chu Mu. However, he wouldn't give up. Now that the sword formation had been broken, he could only rely on his own strength. For a moment, the remaining 6 generals each used their trump cards and attacked Chu Mu frantically. The 4th level of the sword technique domain was unleashed. The powerful power of the sword technique domain immediately caused the swords of the 6 generals to deviate. The mountain quaking force was activated, and the swords were repelled. Chu Mu borrowed the force to slash at the others. Without the sword formation, the pressure on Chu Mu was greatly reduced. He was able to deal with the frenzied attacks of the 6 generals with ease. His mental power was very strong. He could easily distinguish the trajectory of each general's sword and quickly make the most accurate judgment to dodge. Below the arena, in the eyes of the spectating swordsmen, Chu Mu was surrounded by the 6 generals. The 6 generals frantically attacked with their swords like a torrential storm. Meanwhile, Chu Mu's figure swayed in a small area, easily dodging the attacks of the 6 generals. However, although Chu Mu could sense the trajectory of the 6 generals' swords and dodge them, the 6 generals were in a frenzied state. The speed and strength of their swords were 10 to 20% higher than usual. Under such circumstances, Chu Mu couldn't find a chance to successfully counterattack without being attacked. However, he knew very well that the 6 generals' frenzied state couldn't be maintained for long. Once they were exhausted, it would be his chance to counterattack. The 6 generals also knew that Chu Mu must have used up a lot of energy. As long as they persisted with their storm-like attacks, they would definitely be able to hit Chu Mu and defeat Chu Mu in the end. This was a competition of endurance. Whoever couldn't hold on first would lose. Chu Mu wouldn't allow himself to be defeated. The 13 generals wouldn't allow themselves to be defeated either. The spectating swordsmen all held their breaths and subconsciously clenched their fists. They stared with wide eyes at the intense battle in the arena. The 6 generals' storm-like attacks lasted for a full 15 minutes. All of them were clenching their teeth. Their faces were red and the veins on their foreheads were bulging. It was a terrifying sight. Chu Mu's face was also a little pale. However, as he kept dodging, he gradually recovered some of his strength. He was waiting for the best opportunity. Suddenly, there was a momentary delay in the 6 generals' swords, which was grasped by Chu Mu. "Now's the time." Muttering to himself, Chu Mu drew his sword and slashed out with the Deep Realm sword. 2 consecutive slashes instantly broke the 6 generals' swords. The web between their thumb and forefinger cracked. Under the tremendous force, the 6 generals were forced to retreat. Their chests felt stuffy and blood flowed out from the corners of their mouth. Chu Mu's figure was like the wind as he swept past. The tip of his sword smashed into the 6 generals' chests. Activating the mountain quake energy, he instantly sent the 6 generals flying backward. They spat out another mouthful of blood, and their fighting strength was greatly reduced. At this point, the 13 generals had lost most of their fighting strength. All of them had suffered internal injuries. Even if they attacked again, they wouldn't be able to do anything to Chu Mu. "You've won." Fei Kong clutched his chest as he stared at Chu Mu. His expression was very complicated. He originally thought that the Flood Dragon sword array that the 13 generals set up together would definitely be able to defeat Chu Mu. However, the result was completely unexpected. One wrong move and the whole game was lost. Chu Mu's fighting strength was beyond imagination. Only now did Fei Kong truly take Chu Mu seriously. He subconsciously felt that perhaps Chu Mu really had the ability to contend against Lord Sikongzhan. Although the 13 generals had suffered internal injuries, because they were wearing king-grade armor, Chu Mu's attack was greatly weakened. Therefore, their injuries weren't that serious. Of course, this was also because this was only a competition and not a life-and-death battle. Otherwise, Chu Mu wouldn't have shown them any mercy. Hearing Fei Kang's words, Chu Mu's expression didn't change. However, the other 12 generals' expressions changed greatly. They were very unwilling to accept this result, but they couldn't do anything. Chu Mu defeated them with strength and not any trick. They had nothing to say about their defeat. Compared to the 13 generals' sorry state, Chu Mu's face was somewhat pale. This was because he had overused his strength. He didn't suffer any injuries and could slowly recover after a little rest. Only now did the swordsmen below the arena react. They were all extremely excited. Chu Mu had defeated the 13 generals under Xikongzhan. This was real and not a dream. In other words, Chu Mu truly had the ability to compete with Xikongzhan. He wasn't like Qin Shanhe, who was easily defeated by Xikongzhan. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 676. Since I've won, call Xikongzhan out, Chu Mu said to Fei Kong after recovering some of his strength. Lord Xikongzhan has already left, Fei Kong said directly as he stared at Chu Mu. What? Chu Mu was stunned. The swordsmen below the arena were also very puzzled. Didn't they say that as long as Chu Mu defeated the 13 generals, he would be able to fight Xikongzhan? Looking at the current situation, it didn't seem to be the case. A wave of anger emerged in all the swordsmen's hearts. They felt that they had been tricked. However, as the person involved, Chu Mu remained calm. He looked at Fei Kong and said indifferently, "What did Xikongzhan tell you to tell me? How did you know?" Fei Kong blurted out in surprise. He immediately reacted and shut his mouth. After organizing his words, he said again, 3 days ago, Lord Xikongzhan left here and became an elite disciple. He asked me to tell you, you are very talented and qualified to be my opponent. However, whether you can become my true opponent depends on whether you can become an elite disciple within 3 months. If you can, our contest will begin after you become an elite disciple. These were Lord Xikongzhan's original words. Elite disciple. Chu Mu muttered and nodded. In fact, in his heart, Chu Mu really didn't have the confidence to defeat Xikongzhan. He needed more time. Therefore, it might be better to leave the contest until after he became an elite disciple. Moreover, when the teacher-in-chief said to let Chu Mu become the #1 official disciple before he became an elite disciple, it didn't mean that Chu Mu had to defeat Xikongzhan. Now that Xikongzhan had become an elite disciple, who among the official disciples could be Chu Mu's opponent? Didn't the title of #1 fall on Chu Mu's head? Although it still felt strange, it had already become a reality. The swordsmen below were all stunned. They were all dumbfounded and couldn't react for a while. They didn't come here to watch the battle between Chu Mu and the 13 generals, but to watch the battle between Chu Mu and Xikongzhan after he defeated the 13 generals. Grand Elder is mighty. An ancient Sword Alliance swordsman quickly reacted and shouted loudly. Supreme Elder is invincible. Supreme Elder is first. Thousands of ancient Sword Alliance swordsmen raised their hands and shouted, their momentum astonishing. Some of the swordsmen in the surroundings were also affected by this atmosphere, raising their fists and shouting. Since Xikongzhan had already left and Chu Mu had become the deserving #1 official disciple, there was no need for him to continue staying here, and he swiftly left the #1 sword combat arena to return to the sword tower to recover his strength. As Chu Mu left, the onlooking swordsman also left. Old 8, are you alright? Fei Kong said to the 8th battle general. The 8th general was the one who took the brunt of Chu Mu's attack. There was a thin wound on his chest. His tough royal armor was pierced through, and even his inner armor was pierced through. There was an even more obvious wound on his chest. If Chu Mu had not shown mercy, that sword might have pierced through his heart. Among the 13 generals, the 8th general was the most heavily injured. He had lost the ability to move, and had to be supported by 2 other generals to stand firm. Fortunately, he had already taken an elixir, and the wound on his heart was gradually healing. Advanced stage. The 8th general's voice was low as he said these words with difficulty. What? The generals supporting him did not understand. Old 8, you mean Chu Mu's control of power has reached advanced stage. Fei Kang's expression changed. The 8th general nodded slightly. Fei Kang looked at the 8th general's wound again, and nodded. Only a sword that has reached advanced stage can have such power. At this point, Fei Kang was convinced of his loss. Third transformation sword essence, third transformation esoteric meaning, power control that reached advanced stage, and sword technique domain that was above his own. Such strength was actually close to Lord Xikongzhan's. Go back and cultivate well. Strive to pass the Sword Venerable's exam and become an elite disciple. You can meet Lord Xikongzhan as soon as possible, Fei Kang said. The 13 generals left together. Because Chu Mu had defeated the 13 generals and became the #1 official disciple, the Ancient Sword Alliance's reputation had reached a new peak. In just a few days, a large number of swordsmen had signed up to join the Ancient Sword Alliance, causing the number of members to increase rapidly. It had already exceeded 10,000. The rapid growth of the Ancient Sword Alliance had undoubtedly made Su Haoshao and the others very excited. At the same time, they became busy because the more people there were, the more difficult it would be to manage. Su Haoshao had created the Ancient Sword Alliance in hopes that the Ancient Sword Alliance could develop steadily and prevent anything that would be detrimental to the Ancient Sword Alliance. These were Su Haoshao and the others' matters, so Chu Mu did not need to care at all. After returning to the Sword Tower, Chu Mu used some time to recover the energy he had expended. Then, he reminisced about the battle with the 13 generals. The Flood Dragon sword formation was very exquisite. If Chu Mu had not found that instant of opportunity and counterattacked in a spurt of energy, he would have lost to the Flood Dragon sword formation. In the end, he won, but it was not an easy victory. #1 Official Disciple, Qin Shanhe muttered to himself. He had wholeheartedly wanted to defeat Xikongzhan. Aside from wiping away his previous shame, it was not that he did not obtain the #1 official disciple title. No matter how short the time was, as long as he obtained the #1 official disciple title, it would be a supreme glory. After becoming an elite disciple, there would definitely be many teams inviting him, and his value would increase greatly. Unfortunately, once Xikongzhan left, the #1 official disciple title would belong to Chu Mu. Chu Mu could defeat the Flood Dragon sword formation set up by the 13 generals, but Qin Shanhe admitted that he could not do it. Forever #2. Even though he had obtained the #1 official disciple title and achieved the goal set by the head instructor, Chu Mu still did not relax. He was very clear that this was not the end, but the beginning. The elite disciples were the real stage. The official disciples were at most the reserve. Everything here was just a small matter. It's getting closer to the half-year agreement that the head instructor mentioned. There's only a little more than a month left. Chu Mu thought to himself, I wonder if I can refine my sword intent and profound to the 4th revolution in the remaining month and challenge the last stage of the puppet sword formation? The puppet sword formation had a total of 9 stages. Now that Chu Mu had reached the 8th stage, there was still the last stage. It could be imagined that the difficulty of the 9th stage of the puppet sword formation would be very high, far higher than the 8th stage. Previously, when he challenged the 8th stage, it was already quite difficult. He did not have the slightest confidence in challenging the 9th stage. Even if he refined his sword intent and profound to the 4th revolution, it would still be very difficult. No matter what, Chu Mu planned to do his best to increase his strength and challenge the last stage of the puppet sword formation. Because this was the cultivation of official disciples. Once he became an elite disciple, he would not have this opportunity. The days that followed passed peacefully. Obtaining the #1 official disciple title also caused a new round of debate. The content of the debate was nothing more than whether Chu Mu could fight against Xikongzhan. A portion of Chu Mu's supporters believed that even if Chu Mu fought against Sikong Zhan, he would definitely not be defeated by Sikong Zhan's sword, and might even defeat Sikong Zhan. The other portion were Sikong Zhan's supporters. They believed that once Chu Mu and Sikong Zhan fought, the loser would definitely be Chu Mu. The different viewpoints caused the debate to gradually become more intense, and then caused many conflict. Almost every day, there would be people competing with their swords in every sword battle arena. This kind of debate did not bring any trouble to Chu Mu. Instead, it made him even more famous and in the limelight. However, the famous Chu Mu stayed in his sword tower and cultivated day and night. In order to increase his strength as much as possible in a short period of time, Chu Mu made adjustments to his cultivation time. He temporarily gave up the tempering of the heavenly wasteland's sword yuan and shortened the cultivation time of swordsmanship. Techniques such as the mountain quaking force and the domain of swordsmanship were temporarily put aside, and focused on the control of power. In this way, Chu Mu could free up more time. What was the use of this free time? Chu Mu had already planned to use this time to comprehend the fourth handprint of the 9 Revolutions' heavenly shocking seal. Once the fourth handprint was successfully created, he would use this time to temper his sword will and profound meaning. Chu Mu's fighting skills had already improved to a certain level. Unless he had some fortuitous encounter, it would be difficult for him to make any significant improvement in a short period of time. It would require a long period of tempering. There was not much time left. Even if Chu Mu spent all his time on fighting skills, he would not be able to make any significant improvement. Therefore, he temporarily gave up. As for the heavenly wasteland sword yuan, it had now reached the limit. The daily tempering was just a routine. To a certain extent, it was also to maintain the purity of the sword yuan. Temporarily stopping for more than a month would not have any impact. However, if the time was prolonged, the purity of the sword yuan would decrease. Everything was expedient in order to improve his strength as soon as possible. Chu Mu was like a clockwork, like a robot that did not know fatigue. Every day, he would spend 24 hours. Originally, he would spend 4 hours studying the handprint. Now, he would spend 16 hours studying the handprint. Of the remaining 8 hours, 6 hours would be used to cultivate the control of power and swordsmanship, and 2 hours would be used to reflect and rest. 3 days. It only took 3 days for Chu Mu to successfully study and perfect the fourth handprint of the 9 Revolutions' heavenly shocking seal. On the 4th day, he began to temper his sword will. Originally, it would also take 4 hours to temper his sword will. However, now Chu Mu's spiritual thoughts had condensed into a mind star. The purity had more than doubled, and the recovery speed had also greatly improved. Chu Mu also divided the tempering of the sword will into 2 stages. Each stage would take 8 hours. In this way, he could ensure the smooth tempering of the sword will and would not be affected by the consumption of spiritual thoughts. Today's 1 day was equivalent to the previous 4 days. The efficiency was greatly improved, and the time was greatly shortened. Every day, Chu Mu could feel his sword intent becoming purer and purer. He was getting closer and closer to the fourth revolution. Chapter 677. Outside the Sky-Edge Sword Palace, a huge black flying battleship slowed down and lowered its altitude. On the left and right sides of the flying battleship, there was a special symbol. It was a blazing flame that seemed to be alive. Within the flame, there was also a sword that seemed to be being calcined by the fire. This flying battleship landed in the official disciple area of the Sky-Edge Sword Palace. From the battleship, a group of people walked down one after another. A portion of the Sky-Edge Sword Palace's instructors went up to welcome them. "Instructor, I wonder why you're looking for me?" Chu Mu asked. "There is indeed something." Ji Tianxiang smiled and said, "First, congratulations on becoming the #1 official disciple. When you see the head instructor, you can make a request of him." "Many thanks." Chu Mu smiled slightly and said, In less than half a year your strength has increased so quickly. In the history of the Sky-Edge Sword Palace, there is no one like you. Ji Tianxiang sighed again and said, there is still some time. You might as well continue to increase your strength and see if you can pass the 9th stage of the puppet sword formation before becoming an elite disciple. Instructor, is there any mystery behind the 9th stage? Chu Mu immediately asked. If you can pass it, you will naturally know. If you can't, it is useless even if you know. Ji Tianxiang said, however, it is not that easy to pass the 9th stage of the puppet sword formation. Since the establishment of the Sky-Edge Sword Palace, only 2 people have successfully passed it. If you can pass it, you will be the 3rd person and will be recorded in the Sword Palace's history. Chu Mu was startled when he heard this. Since the establishment of the Sky-Edge Sword Palace, only 2 people had successfully passed the 9th stage of the puppet sword formation. It seemed that the Sky-Edge Sword Palace had been established for more than 10,000 years. After 10,000 years, according to the 10-year cycle, there would be 2 million official disciples in each cycle. How many people would there be? With so many people, only 2 people had passed the 9th stage. It was truly incomparably difficult. After thinking about it deeply, there was nothing impossible about it. In order to pass the 8th stage of the puppet sword array, one's sword intent and profound had to reach the 3rd revolution, one's control of power had to reach a profound level, and one's combat skills had to reach an extremely high level. Any one of these 3 conditions was very difficult for the majority of official disciples to achieve, let alone all 3 of them at the same time. If any of the 3 conditions were missing, it would be impossible to pass the 8th stage. Even if Chu Mu met all 3 conditions, it would still be very difficult for him to pass the 8th stage because he was not proficient enough. The immemorial world was indeed a place where geniuses came forth in large numbers. However, to be able to meet the 3 requirements during the period of being an official disciple, the word genius could no longer describe them. For example, Qin Shanhe, who was also a true genius, had only cultivated his sword will profound meaning to the 2nd revolution, and his control of power was only at the initial entry level. The improvement of your strength depends on your own efforts. How far you can go is up to you. Ji Tianxiang said, now let's talk about business. Chu Mu nodded. In the immemorial world, the human race is on the decline, and there are not many places left to reside. Ji Tianxiang said, the Xiling continent is one of the places where the human race resides. Our Sky-Edge Sword Palace is located in the east of the Xiling continent, the Tantai clan is in the west, and the Great Sky Sect is in the south. The 3 major factions have similar strength and jointly protect the human race residing in the Xiling continent. There is also competition between them. Chu Mu didn't say anything. His understanding of the immemorial world was still at a superficial level. He could even say that aside from the Sky-Edge Sword Palace and Qin Shanhe's explanations, he didn't know anything else. This was because recently, he had spent all his time on cultivation. The Tantai clan is a major clan that has a heritage of over 10,000 years. In terms of numbers, they might not be comparable to our Sky-Edge Sword Palace, but due to the clan's bloodline, almost every Tantai clan's descendant has extraordinary talents. The Great Sky Sect is a sect and is similar to our Sky-Edge Sword Palace in terms of nature. However, in terms of numbers, they are also inferior to our Sky-Edge Sword Palace, Ji Tianxiang said slowly. Every once in a while, which might be 5 to 6 years or 10 years, our Sky-Edge Sword Palace would send a batch of disciples to the Tantai clan and the Great Sky Sect for an exchange. Sometimes, the Tantai clan and the Great Sky Sect would send some disciples to our Sky-Edge Sword Palace for an exchange. After hearing this, Chu Mu knew that Ji Tianxiang's purpose of looking for him might be related to the Tantai clan or the Great Sky Sect. You guessed it right. Not long ago, the Tantai clan sent people over. Ji Tianxiang smiled and continued, the elders are escorts, and 3 of them are the ones to be exchanged. They are Tantai Tianlong, Tantai Feishing, and Tantai Yinyu. The three of them are currently the most outstanding individuals in the Tantai clan's outer Insti Toot. The Tantai clan was also divided into the inner Insti Toot, and the outer Insti Toot was equivalent to the official disciples of the Sky Edge Sword Palace. The Tantai clan's members were much lesser than the Sky Edge Sword Palace. Of course, the Sky Edge Sword Palace recruited disciples from everywhere, but the Tantai clan was a clan. Clans had their advantages like bloodline power and so on. To be able to stand out among the outer Insti Toot disciples and become the most outstanding three, it was enough to prove how extraordinary the three of them were. It might be an exchange, but our Sky Edge Sword Palace can't lose our reputation, right? Ji Tianxiang's eyes were filled with smiles. If Xikong Zhan was still around, he would be the one to lead. You and Qin Shanhe would follow. Now that Xikong Zhan has become an elite disciple, you will be the one to lead. Qin Shanhe and Fei Kong will follow. When Chu Mu heard this, he couldn't help but laugh. So this was the case. An exchange was an exchange, but they couldn't lose. They had to win in a glorious manner. Chu Mu, Qin Shanhe, and Fei Kong could be considered as the most outstanding three among the current official disciples. As for the third-ranked official disciple, there was still a gap between him and Fei Kong. After thinking for a moment, Chu Mu agreed to this matter. He also wanted to witness the splendor of the Tantai clan's most outstanding outer Insti Toot disciples. The news of the Tantai clan riding the flying battleship had already spread like wildfire. Almost all the official disciples of the Sky Edge Sword Palace knew about it. Those disciples who had similar experiences also knew what was going on. Since they were here for an exchange, there was no need for formalities. It was the easiest to go straight to the sword contest arena. At the number 1 sword contest arena, the Tantai clan's elders and the Sword Palace's instructors were standing together. The Tantai clan's disciples were also standing together with 3 of them as the leaders. Chu Mu, Qin Shanhe, and Fei Kong were also standing at the side. Behind them were the Sky Edge Sword Palace's swordsmen who were gathered to spectate. The clan head heard that the Sword Palace produced a few outstanding official disciples. He specially asked me to wait for the clan's juniors to come for an exchange. One of the Tantai clan's elders said. Once he spoke, he was just being polite and had the same meaning as before. The 3 of you are all outstanding individuals. It is our Sword Palace's honor to be able to come and exchange with our Sword Palace's disciples. One of the instructors said, who didn't know how to be polite. Since that is the case, let's begin. One of the Tantai clan's elders who had a rather impatient temper said, Yenyu, you go up first. Tantai Yinyu bowed slightly and executed her movement art. She drifted up the sword contest arena like a wisp of smoke. She wasn't more than 30 years old. She had a gentle aura presence and a graceful figure. There seemed to be a hazy mist on her face, making it hard for others to see her appearance clearly. When one saw her by chance, they would have a breathtaking feeling. She gave off a gentle beauty like a misty rain. Tantai Yinyu's pink gown made her figure even more gentle and beautiful. Most of the Sky Edge Sword Palace's disciples were staring at Tantai Yinyu. They were attracted by her and couldn't take their eyes off her. Fei Kong, you will be in charge of this battle, one of the instructors said. Fei Kong immediately nodded and leaped up. His figure flickered and appeared on the sword contest arena. Senior brother, please have mercy on me. Tantai Yinyu bowed with a graceful posture. Her voice was as gentle as spring water, pleasing to the ears. Many of the swordsmen revealed an intoxicated expression. Please. For Fei Kong to be able to cultivate to his current strength, his will couldn't be said to be weak. He was only slightly affected by the other party and immediately sobered up. He cupped his hands and performed a sword salute. His tone carried traces of killing intent. Receive my sword, Tantai Yinyu said. Her voice was still so gentle and beautiful. Her sword seemed to have been drawn from her sleeves, and was like a spirit snake. With a flick of the sword light flickered and its speed increased rapidly. It was silent and had the beauty of a gentle breeze and drizzle. In front of Fei Kang's eyes, it was as if an immortal had descended from the heavens. A gentle breeze blew on his face and a drizzle spread out. It gave him the urge to relax, sit on the ground, and enjoy the beautiful scenery before him. The powerful will caused Fei Kang to sober up instantly. Tantai Yinyu's soft and slender sword was already in front of his eyes. The trace of cold light on the tip of the sword caused Fei Kang's pupils to shrink rapidly. He quickly executed his movement art and dodged Tantai Yinyu's sword with a strange flicker. He then counterattacked with his sword. Tantai Yinyu's figure was graceful and her movement art was also graceful. It was as if a gentle breeze had blown over. Her sword was also very graceful. It was like a drizzle, silent and pervasive. Most importantly, Tantai Yinyu's every move seemed to contain an indescribable power that could affect one's mind. Fei Kang, who bore the brunt of it, was the most affected. Qin Shanha's face was solemn, while Chu Mu's eyes flashed with a trace of astonishment. The cultivation art that Tantai Yinyu practiced was definitely not ordinary. With Fei Kang's spiritual will, it seemed to be somewhat difficult for him to resist. Although the influence was minute and Fei Kang could resist it, he would lose the initiative every time and it would be difficult for him to form an effective counterattack. Looking at Tantai Yinyu again, the moment she launched her attacks, there was a continuous momentum. The power of each sword strike did not seem strong or fast, but it was like a gentle breeze blowing by, like a drizzle that never stopped, penetrating all openings, making it extremely difficult for Fei Kang to block or dodge. In front of his eyes, the sword light turned into an endless drizzle that fell without end. The soft and slender sword in Tantai Yinyu's hand seemed to have come alive. Every time her sword strike was blocked, a ding-ding sound would ring out. Mixed with the gentle breeze and drizzle, the sound was very pleasant to the ears. The entire sword battle arena seemed to have become Tantai Yinyu's home ground. Everyone's gaze was focused on Tantai Yinyu. The swordsman's eyes also seemed to be filled with Tantai Yinyu's graceful figure. Many people knew that Fei Kang was at a disadvantage. If he didn't have any other methods, his defeat was only a matter of time. Chapter 678. Gentle wind and drizzle, fresh rain on the empty mountain, continuous drizzle, gentle breeze, her graceful and gentle figure danced in the air, sometimes like a colorful butterfly, sometimes like a willow, and sometimes like flowing water. It was like a painting of nature, beautiful beyond words. Watching Tantai Yinyu's battle was like watching a beautiful piece of art. It made people unconsciously intoxicated. Fei Kang's strength wasn't weak, but compared to Tantai Yinyu, there was still a slight difference. Fei Kang's cultivation technique wasn't as good as Tantai Yinyu's, so he had to constantly endure Tantai Yinyu's attacks and eventually lost. "Thank you for letting me win." Tantai Yinyu sheathed her sword and bowed. Her voice was still so gentle and beautiful. "Thank you for letting me win." Fei Kang also bowed. He wasn't a sore loser. "This disciple of your sword palace is quite strong." An elder of the Tantai clan chuckled and said, "However, compared to our Tantai clan's disciples, he is still a little lacking. The second match, Qin Shanha, is up to you." An instructor of the sword palace said, "Feishing, you go." An elder of the Tantai clan smiled. Both Qin Shanha and Tantai Feishing nodded and leaped onto the battle arena. Qin Shanha had a strong body and was tall and sturdy. He was like a mountain standing on the ground, steady and heavy. There was a faint trace of dominance surrounding him. On the other hand, Tantai Feishing had a strong and slender body. He stood on the arena with a sense of elegance and his eyes were like the stars. "Brother Qin, please go easy on me." Tantai Feishing had a faint smile on his face as he cupped his hands towards Qin Shanha and said, "Draw your sword." Qin Shanha cupped his hands and said. His huge sword was unsheathed. Tantai Feishing smiled faintly and elegantly. His sword was already in his hand, and there seemed to be starlight revolving around it. Could it be that Tantai Feishing also comprehended the star quintessence? Chu Mu's heart moved as he guessed. Qin Shanha comprehended the earth quintessence, and had refined it to the second revolution. When he slashed out with his huge sword, there was a faint trace of heaviness. It was like a mountain falling from the sky and crushing towards Tantai Feishing. Chu Mu could tell at a glance that Qin Shanha's swordsmanship had improved a little. He might have been inspired by his battle with Sikongzhan that day, and after a few months of hard work, he finally understood. However, there was still an obvious gap between Qin Shanha's swordsmanship realm and Sikongzhan's. The heavy sword pressed down like a mountain, causing the members of the Tantai clan to exclaim in surprise. Tantai Feishing turned into a shooting star and tore through the sky. His sword was like a meteor chasing after the moon as it tore through the sky. One was steady while the other was light. Two completely different swords clashed instantly. Qin Shanha's sword paused for a moment, while Tantai Feishing borrowed the force to spin around and appeared behind Qin Shanha, slashing with his sword. The sword light was like a falling star. This sword was extremely exquisite. It was as if it was formed by the heavens, and there was no trace of it. However, Qin Shanha didn't panic in the face of danger. He wielded his giant sword calmly. His strong body spun around and brought along a strong gust of wind. The giant sword swept horizontally, and there was an ear-piercing clang. Tantai Feishing's sword was instantly repelled. The giant sword cleaved with a force that could split mountains. The power on the sword dissipated, and the giant sword became light while its speed increased rapidly. Tantai Feishing took advantage of the momentum to spin his body. Specks of starlight circled around his body, as if it was supporting his body from falling to the ground. He spun again in midair and drew an arc to dodge Qin Shanha's giant sword while counterattacking at the same time. Tantai Feishing's speed was extremely fast and light. His sword brought along specks of starlight to confuse the eyes. However, Qin Shanha's body was steady and firm like a mountain. The giant sword in his hand was as light as a feather, and he was handling it with ease. Qin Shanha's swordsmanship domain was still at the 3rd level, but his swordsmanship skills had obviously improved. Until now, neither of them had used their entry-realm swords. That was a killer move that would determine the outcome of the battle. No matter what, Tantai Feishing couldn't break through Qin Shanha's defense. If this continued, it would be impossible for him to win. On the surface, Tantai Feishing was a polite person. However, he was very proud in his heart. He wouldn't allow himself to be defeated, nor could he accept a draw. He had to defeat his opponent. Sparks flew everywhere, attracting the attention of countless swordsmen around. After attacking for a long time without success, Tantai Feishing seemed to be a little impatient. As he turned around, he swung his sword light. It split into 3, and each of them looked very real. They slashed towards Qin Shanha from the left, middle, and right. When one of the sword light neared, it poured its power into it and instantly exploded. It was the entry realm. Attacks from 3 directions were very difficult for Qin Shanha to block. His giant sword could only block the entry realm sword light. The 2 sword lights on the left and right would definitely hit him. In the face of danger, Qin Shanha's expression didn't change. He swung his giant sword across the sky and poured his power into it to block Tantai Feishing's entry realm sword light. The other 2 sword lights fell in the blink of an eye. They had already broken through Qin Shanha's protective sword aura and slashed his shoulder. The power of the 2 sword lights was extraordinary. Even though Qin Shanha was wearing a King Realm armor, he might not be able to block them completely. If he was injured, it would definitely affect his performance. Under Tantai Feishing's continuous attacks, he would gradually be at a disadvantage. In the blink of an eye, just as Qin Shanha's shoulders were about to be hit by the sword gleams, An awl-like short sword appeared in Qin Shanha's left hand. As he waved it, it turned into a shadow and instantly shattered the two sword gleams. The giant sword and Tantai Feishing's sword collided. Under the terrifying and ear-piercing collision, Qin Shanha's body trembled while Tantai Feishing flew back. The short sword instantly connected to the giant sword's head, turning the giant sword into a unique sword weapon. With a swing of the sword, the short sword silently pierced towards Tantai Feishing, who was approaching again. Tantai Feishing was indeed formidable, but he wasn't as good as Xikongzhan. When facing Qin Shanha, who suddenly changed his battle style, it was hard for him to deal with it accurately. As he revolved, the unique giant sword seemed to be formed by nature. Furthermore, it was constantly increasing its power as it slashed down again. It was an entry-realm sword. Tantai Feishing's expression changed drastically. This sword was like a mountain pressing down on him, suffocating him. When he wanted to use the entry realm to block, his reaction was slightly slower and he was barely able to react. As the giant sword slashed down, Tantai Feishing blocked it. However, the web between his thumb and forefinger was torn, and the sword flew out of his hand. He flew backward and uncontrollably fell off the stage. His chest was swollen and stuffy. Compared to the injuries on his body, Tantai Feishing felt even worse. He actually lost. The few elders of the Tantai clan didn't look too good either. "Thank you for letting me win." Qin Shanha cupped his hands and said to Tantai Feishing, "Thank you for letting me win." Tantai Feishing might feel terrible in his heart, but he still had the proper demeanor. He cupped his hands as well. Victory and defeat are common for swordsmen. You will only know the taste of victory after experiencing defeat. Tantai Tianlong patted on Tantai Feishing's shoulder and spoke with a trace of a smile. "Big brother Tianlong, the last match is up to you. You must defeat him." Tantai Feishing nodded forcefully. He glanced at Chu Mu and spoke to Tantai Tianlong. Tantai Tianlong only smiled and nodded slightly. He didn't say anything, but his expression was extremely confident. It was as though defeating Chu Mu wasn't something difficult for him. "Tianlong is the number one in our Tantai clan's outer INSTI. Tianlong will fight in the last match." One of the elders of the Tantai clan spoke. He seemed to have thought of something and revealed a smear of a smile. The other elders and the members of the Tantai clan revealed smiles as well. Their expressions told the members of the Sky Edge Sword Palace that victory was in sight. They had absolute confidence in Tantai Tianlong. It could be seen that Tantai Tianlong, who had yet to fight, had extraordinary strength and was extremely tyrannical. Chu Mu is also the number one official disciple of our Sky Edge Sword Palace. He will fight in the last match as well. One of the Sky Edge Sword Palace's instructors smiled and nodded to indicate Chu Mu. Tantai Tianlong leaped up like a dragon soaring in the sky. He took a few steps forward and landed on the sword battle arena like a wriggling flood dragon. There was an indescribable dominance and elegance. Chu Mu didn't even take any stance, but his figure moved like a shadow. Everyone only felt a blur before their eyes and Chu Mu appeared on the sword battle arena. Great movement technique. Tantai Tianlong revealed a trace of a smile and said slowly, "I originally thought that my opponent would be Xikongzhan. I didn't expect it to be you." When Tantai Tianlong mentioned Xikongzhan's name, there was a trace of astonishing sharpness that flashed across his eyes. There seemed to be a trace of unwillingness. Chu Mu knew about Tantai Tianlong's unusual look from Ji Tianxiang. 4 years ago, the Sky Edge Sword Palace had sent a few people to the Tantai clan for an exchange. The number one official disciple of the Sky Edge Sword Palace was Xikongzhan. Back then, Xikongzhan swept across the Tantai clan's outer courtyard and was unmatched. Tantai Tianlong had yet to reveal his outstanding talent in the Tantai clan's outer courtyard, but he had personally witnessed Xikongzhan's prowess. After that, he used it as a form of motivation to improve himself. This time, He felt that he had become strong enough and wanted to have a showdown with Sikongjian. He didn't expect that his opponent wasn't Sikongjian, but a swordsman from the small world. Tantai Tianlong didn't know much about the small world, and he didn't have the intention to look down on Chu Mu. However, he felt that apart from Sikongjian, no one in the Sky Edge Sword Palace's outer courtyard was a match for him. Chu Mu wasn't a match either. This wasn't arrogance, but a kind of belief. The belief in himself, the belief that he would win. A boundless aura was emitted from Tantai Tianlong's body. Vaguely, there seemed to be a dragon's roar that echoed throughout the heavens and earth. Compared to Tantai Tianlong's increasingly powerful and boundless aura, Chu Mu seemed very ordinary. He stood there and looked ordinary. However, the few elders of the Tantai clan had a grave expression while the Sword Palace's instructors nodded their heads secretly with a trace of satisfaction flashing across their faces. Unmoved by external objects, no matter how majestic the other party's aura was, he would remain unmoved like a mountain and as deep as the sea. This was a kind of state and also a kind of belief. It was a belief that was superior to Tantai Tianlong's. The smile on the corner of Tantai Tianlong's mouth vanished and was replaced by a trace of seriousness. He didn't dare to underestimate Chu Mu anymore. There was a voice in the depths of his heart that reminded him to treat Chu Mu as a true opponent, a powerful enemy. Gradually, Sikongjian's figure in Tantai Tianlong's heart was replaced by Chu Mu's figure. This was the final battle of the exchange, and it was also the battle that would determine the victor. Chapter 679. After this battle, I will remember your name, Tantai Tianlong said slowly. Every word was powerful like a dragon's roar. After this battle, you won't forget my name either, Chu Mu said indifferently. The two sentences were almost the same, but they contained two different meanings. Ha 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 ha! Tantai Tianlong couldn't help but burst out in laughter. His figure flashed like a dragon soaring across the sky. He unsheathed his sword and slashed at Chu Mu. The sword was like a breeze, a thunderclap, and a torrent. It wasn't restricted by any form, which made Chu Mu's eyes light up. This sword displayed Tantai Tianlong's sword art realm, which was above Qin Shan He. When the eight-sided sky desolate sword was unsheathed, Tantai Tianlong saw a fine arc of light in front of him. It was like a line of light between the sky and the water. It appeared from nothing and shone brightly. In the blink of an eye, the light disappeared. In terms of sword art realm, Chu Mu, who had comprehended the combat style, had more variations and was more fluent. He was above Tantai Tianlong. It was fine if he didn't draw his sword, but once he drew his sword, the expressions of the Tantai clan's elders changed. What a profound sword art realm! Tianlong is in trouble. An elder transmitted a message. Not necessarily. Tianlong's sword intent and quintessence have been refined to the third revolution. His control of strength has also reached the advanced stage a few days ago. Once he uses his full strength, he will definitely be able to defeat his opponent. Another elder transmitted a message. That's right. Tianlong's talent can be ranked in the top 3 in our Tantai clan for the past 10,000 years. He is definitely not below Sikongjian. It is already a great fortune for the Sky Edge Sword Palace to have Sikongjian. The third elder transmitted a message. Tianlong will definitely win this battle. He will also be able to suppress the Sky Edge Sword Palace's arrogance and take back the loss from a few years ago. The fourth elder transmitted a message. Smiles appeared on the faces of the elders. In the blink of an eye, Tantai Tianlong's sword changed dozens of times. Each sword contained dozens of changes, and all of them were aimed at Chu Mu's flaws. However, those flaws disappeared in an instant. As for Chu Mu's sword, it was a simple slash. When it landed in front of Tantai Tianlong's eyes, there were hundreds of thousands of variations. Each variation gave him a feeling that he could not dodge or dodge, as if there was nowhere safe in the world. Tantai Tianlong released his spiritual consciousness and covered the surroundings. The trajectory of Chu Mu's sword immediately appeared in his spiritual consciousness. With a slash of the sword, there was the sound of wind and thunder, but it disappeared in an instant. His sword's speed increased to the extreme, piercing through Chu Mu's sword and stabbing towards Chu Mu's forehead, causing Chu Mu to feel a piercing pain from his forehead. The third revolution's sword intent was unstoppable. Tantai Tianlong's application of sword intent had also reached the extreme. When the sword pierced through Chu Mu's protective sword aura and approached his forehead, Tantai Tianlong's sword origin profound was injected and his strength exploded. The strength reached the tip of the sword, giving Chu Mu an illusion that his forehead was pierced through. When the sword pierced through Chu Mu's head, Tantai Tianlong's expression changed. He felt that the sword had no strength at all. It was just an afterimage. Under the spiritual consciousness, Tantai Tianlong vaguely felt a blurry sword light coming from the side. He released his strength again and hurriedly moved to the side. However, Chu Mu's sword followed him like a shadow and still came from the side. Tantai Tianlong performed his movement technique and changed dozens of times, but he still couldn't get rid of Chu Mu's sword. In terms of understanding of the sword, Chu Mu was above Tantai Tianlong. His sword art realm was higher than Tantai Tianlong's, and his control of strength was more profound than Tantai Tianlong's. No matter how one looked at it, Tantai Tianlong couldn't be compared with Chu Mu. After a dozen changes, Tantai Tianlong managed to obtain a sliver of an opportunity to swing his sword towards Chu Mu. When the two swords clashed, the sword intents clashed. Tantai Tianlong's expression changed. His pure third revolution sword intent was actually defeated. His palm trembled and his sword was about to fly out of his hand. He quickly tightened his grip. Fourth revolution sword intent. Tantai Tianlong was shocked. The few elders of the Tantai clan also had a drastic change in expression. They no longer dared to think that Tantai Tianlong could win against Chu Mu. The instructors of the Sword Palace were also dumbfounded. They knew that Chu Mu's sword intent was at least at the third revolution, but they didn't dare to think that it was at the fourth revolution. The sword intent quintessence would be refined with every revolution and increase in rank. Thinking about it, Chu Mu hadn't been in the Sky Edge Sword Palace for more than half a year. Before that, it was impossible for him to obtain the 9 revolution heart imprint art. In other words, in less than half a year, Chu Mu had refined his sword intent to the 4th revolution. This was something that other swordsmen would need at least 10 years to achieve. In fact, most of the swordsmen wouldn't be able to do it because their soul spirit couldn't withstand it. His sword intent had reached the 4th revolution. This meant that as long as Chu Mu didn't die, his future achievements would be at least the high-grade sword of Gojoseon. However, this wasn't what truly shocked the instructors. In the immemorial world, the human race might be declining, but there was still a large population. There were plenty of geniuses that were born, and there were plenty of geniuses that could refine their sword intent to the 4th revolution. However, none of them were able to do it within half a year. With a superior sword art and a 4th revolution sword intent, Chu Mu was able to suppress Tantai Tianlong. Tantai Tianlong had used all his means, but he was only able to withstand Chu Mu's sword for a short period of time. In the end, Chu Mu pointed his sword at his throat and defeated him. The Tantai clan elders had already guessed this outcome, but they still found it hard to accept it after it happened. A few years ago they were defeated. Now they were defeated again. A few years ago, the Sky Edge Sword Palace had Sikongjan. A few years later, there was another Chu Mu. The Sword Palace is indeed filled with talents. They might have been defeated, but they couldn't let the battle go. It was just a fluke. One of the instructors smiled and was delighted in his heart. However, our Tantai clan's bloodline power will only be revealed after reaching the God-congealing realm. Therefore, the future Tianlong will definitely be able to defeat Chu Mu. Another Tantai clan elder spoke with unwillingness. What he said was true. Swordsmen who possessed the bloodline power inheritance would only reveal their bloodline power after reaching the god-congealing realm, surpassing ordinary swordsmen. After reaching the god-congealing realm, I will fight with you again. Tantai Tianlong stared at Chu Mu and spoke word by word. Anytime. Chu Mu smiled faintly. From then on, the simple exchange between the Tantai clan and the Sky Edge Sword Palace had ended. The following matters were the instructors. Originally, the Tantai clan was planning to tour the Sky Edge Sword Palace after the exchange. However, because Tantai Tianlong was defeated by Chu Mu, he wasn't in the mood to tour the Sky Edge Sword Palace. After the Tantai clan's elders and instructors exchanged some pleasantries, they brought Tantai Tianlong and the other two onto the Sky Soaring battleship and left swiftly. On the Sky Soaring battleship, Tantai Tianlong looked at the ground and contracted his eyes. He looked at Chu Mu and used a voice that only he could hear to say something. His expression was getting increasingly determined and cold. Instructors, if there is nothing else, I will be taking my leave. Chu Mu took a glance at the Sky Soaring battleship and withdrew his gaze before speaking to the instructors. Go ahead and cultivate well. The instructors spoke with hope in their eyes. Qin Shanhe and Fei Kong also bade farewell. Chu Mu, in a few days, I will be applying for the Sword Supreme exam to become an elite disciple. Qin Shanhe followed Chu Mu with large strides and said, I think you will also become an elite disciple soon. When the time comes, why don't we join the same team? We will talk about it when the time comes. Chu Mu replied. All right, we will talk about it when the time comes. Qin Shanhe didn't linger on this issue. He spoke a few more words with Chu Mu before leaving. He returned to his sword tower and prepared for the Sword Supreme exam. As for Fei Kong, he still had some animosity towards Chu Mu. Therefore, he didn't converse with Chu Mu. Defeating the strongest sword practitioner of the Tantai clan's outer Insti was the icing on the cake for Chu Mu. After returning to the sword tower, Chu Mu seized the time to cultivate. His sword intent had already reached the fourth revolution. Chu Mu spent all his time on tempering the ripping quintessence. He had to reach the fourth revolution before the appointed time with the chief instructor. Only then would his strength increase by several folds. Only then would he be able to pass the last stage of the sword puppet formation. There was less than a month left. Every day, he would spend 16 hours tempering the power of the ripping quintessence. Due to the restraint of the other quintessences, the tempering speed of the ripping quintessence was much slower than the sword intent. The tempering time for each revolution was much longer than the sword intent. However, Chu Mu was confident that he could temper the ripping quintessence to the fourth revolution in the remaining time. Other than tempering the ripping quintessence, Chu Mu also focused on the cultivation of the control of his strength. He had a feeling that he wasn't far from breaking through to the next level. In the blink of an eye, another half a month had passed. On the first floor of the sword tower, Chu Mu, who was cultivating his sword skills, suddenly paused. He maintained the posture of thrusting out his sword and froze. He felt that his body seemed to have broken through some shackles. There was a surging feeling of power. Immediately after, Chu Mu's body didn't move at all. He just shook his wrist gently. There seemed to be a luster flashing on the eight-sided sky desolate sword. There seemed to be ripples in the air around the sword. Subsequently, there were traces of light condensing at the tip of the eight-sided sky desolate sword. It only took an instant before it was shot out. It was a ray of sword light. It was so bright that people couldn't look at it directly. The sword light broke through the air at an indescribable speed. In an instant it hit the seal of the sword tower. With a bang, the sword light exploded and the seal caved in. Layers of ripples spread out like water ripples. After a full 3 breaths, the seal caved in and the ripples disappeared. The power of this ray of sword light was no less than that of Chu Mu's deep realm. It directly pierced into the seal. Extreme realm. Chu kept staring at the seal. After 3 breaths, he muttered to himself. There were 3 levels in the realm: initial realm, deep realm, and extreme realm. The extreme realm sword could condense all of one's strength and turn it into a ray of sword light. Its power wasn't inferior to a direct attack with a sword. Next, let me see how many sword strikes I can unleash in a row in the extreme realm. The number of times a sword strike could unleash in a row was related to the battle strength of a swordsman. Think about it. If 2 people fought, one could unleash 8 sword strikes in a row while the other could unleash 10 sword strikes in a row. In a situation where all other aspects were equal, the second person would obviously have the upper hand. Chapter 680. Qin Shanhe passed the Sword Venerable test and was given the title of Mountain River Sword Venerable. He bid farewell to Chu Mu and said that he would wait for Chu Mu among the elite disciples before leaving the official disciple status. Time flew by and something else happened. Zhong Qintian, Zhu Wudao, Yan Zhiyo, and Gu Jianghe all left the status of odd job disciple and passed the test to become official disciples of the Sky Edge Sword Palace. Chu Mu only smiled when he learned of this. On the ancient Sword Continent, these 4 were without a doubt the pride of the heavens. Even in the immemorial world, their talent and potential were much better than ordinary swordsmen. After passing the odd job disciple stage, this kind of training made their minds more stable, which was more beneficial for their future. After becoming an official disciple and enjoying the cultivation resources of an official disciple, Chu Mu believed that they would definitely rise. Their speed might not be comparable to his, but they would definitely surpass many swordsmen. True geniuses could rise again no matter what kind of environment they were in, even if they had to go through a downturn. 3 more days. The tearing profound had finally reached the 4th revolution. Chu Mu's essence, energy, and soul rose to the peak. A terrifying sharpness was emitted without restraint. The air within a 30-meter radius was completely filled with it. All the dust particles were suspended in the air, creating a dusky haze. Chu Mu's eyes flashed. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were clear. The sharpness that filled 100 feet had disappeared. The dust particles fell and settled. It's time to challenge the last stage of the puppet sword formation. Sighing softly, Chu Mu took a step forward and turned into an afterimage. He left the sword tower and headed for the puppet sword formation area. Chu Mu's appearance attracted the attention of countless swordsmen. Among the official disciples of the Sky Edge Sword Palace, Chu Mu was the leader. Zhong Qintian, Zhu Wudao, Yan Zhiyo, Gu Jianghe, and the others all rushed to the puppet sword formation area. Half a year ago, they became odd jobs and Chu Mu became an official disciple. Half a year had passed and Chu Mu had become the #1 official disciple, while they had just become official disciples. It seemed that the gap between them and Chu Mu was getting bigger and bigger. As soon as Chu Mu entered the puppet sword array area, all the swordsmen around the puppet sword array were attracted to him. After entering one of the puppet sword arrays, Chu Mu began to challenge the sword array. Just like last time, the strength of his spiritual power did not increase. Chu Mu did not need to comprehend the sword formations in front of him. With the help of his sword finger, he continuously passed through the sword formations. One level after another, in less than 10 breaths of time, Chu Mu had reached the 7th level. At this point, it was time for Chu Mu to treat this seriously. He unsheathed the 8-sided desolation swords and spent some time to easily pass the 8-fold sword formation of the 7th level. The 8th stage of the puppet sword formation, 9 transformations sword formation. Last time, Chu Mu could only withstand the pressure of the 9 transformations sword formation. One revolution after another was like a millstone crushing him. He had no chance to comprehend the mysteries of the 9 transformations sword formation. But now, his strength had increased several times. He could completely withstand the pressure of the 9 transformations, sword formation, and comprehend the mysteries of the 9 transformations, sword formation. The pressure of the 9 transformations, sword formation, was very strange. One revolution after another was like a millstone, constantly crushing over. The pressure on the spiritual level and the physical level were both present. Under the double pressure, one's resistance would be constantly worn down until it was unbearable. At this time, Chu Mu was resisting the crushing pressure of the 9 transformations, sword formation, with absolute strength. No matter how the 9 transformations, sword formation crushed him, it was unable to make Chu Mu feel strained. This was because Chu Mu's strength had increased several times. Under the pressure of the 9 transformations, sword formation, the 9 transformations sword puppet unsheathed its sword and launched an endless stream of attacks on Chu Mu. These attacks were sometimes like a continuous drizzle, sometimes like a gentle breeze, sometimes like a raging thunderbolt, and sometimes like a heavy earth crushing down. Chu Mu released his spiritual consciousness and performed the flying swan illusory step. He constantly dodged the attacks of the 9 transformations, sword puppet. At the same time, he constantly felt the mysteries of the 9 transformations, sword formation. He memorized it and slowly comprehended it. Although the 9 transformations, sword formation, was also one of the basic sword formations, compared to the previous sword formations, it was more mysterious and exquisite. It was also more difficult to comprehend. Chu Mu has become stronger. Rumor has it that his sword intent has reached the 4th revolution. It seems like even his profound has reached the 4th revolution. 4th revolution sword intent, 4th revolution profound. Terrifying, what a terrifying guy. With this kind of strength, even if he becomes an elite disciple, he will be able to stand out very quickly. I can already confirm that once Chu Mu becomes an elite disciple, he will definitely be invited by the 3 great battle teams. The 3 great battle teams. Many swordsmen revealed a yearning expression. Joining a strong battle team was much better than joining a weak battle team. That might not be the case. In the crowd, a swordsman sneered and said, it was Jin Mu Lei, who had been defeated by Chu Mu. Within the 9 transformations, sword formation, Chu Mu had already comprehended the mysteries of the 9 transformations, sword formation, and reached the limit as of now. It's time to break the formation. Taking a deep breath, Chu Mu did not dodge this time. He unsheathed the Desolation Sky sword, and the sword seemed to disappear into the void. Then, it suddenly appeared at the neck of a sword puppet. With a burst of power, the Profound Realm sword beheaded the puppet. The 9 transformations, sword formation became incomplete and flaws appeared. Under Chu Mu's sword, the 9 transformations sword puppet was quickly defeated by Chu Mu. The 9 transformations sword formation was broken. He passed it. Chu Mu is going to pass the last stage of the puppet sword formation. I wonder what kind of power the last stage of the puppet sword formation has. Jin Mu Lei's face was gloomy. Ever since he was defeated by Chu Mu, he had been holding a grudge against Chu Mu. Therefore, he could not bear to see Chu Mu doing well. The 9th stage of the puppet sword formation was also the last stage. 10 directions sword formation. There were 10 sword puppets in the 10 directions sword formation. They stood in a circle and surrounded Chu Mu. In a split second, the 10 directions sword formation was activated. A wave of pressure spread out, making Chu Mu feel like he was in a small world with nowhere to hide. The pressure attacked his spiritual world and his body. There was even a trace of unstoppable pressure that seeped into his body and attacked his internal organs. Chu Mu's qi and blood showed signs of surging. Fortunately, Chu Mu had cultivated the sky desolate sword body. He did not let go of any part of his body and had completely refined it. His internal organs were more than 10 times stronger than ordinary Origin Realm swordsmen. Therefore, he was able to withstand the pressure. However, the pressure was unimaginably huge. Chu Mu only felt his body sink as if he was about to sink. The intense star in his spiritual world was constantly flickering. It spread out faint starlight ripples and shattered the waves of pressure. The 10 directions sword puppet was activated. When the sword was unsheathed, there was nowhere to hide. Chu Mu felt like he could not dodge and could only attack with his sword. When the sword was unsheathed, Chu Mu immediately felt that it was difficult. The terrifying pressure turned into chains that wrapped around his sword and arm. Chu Mu had no choice but to erupt with even more power to move normally. Without a doubt, this would consume even more power. Chu Mu did not dare to waste any time. The pressure of the 10 directions sword formation was too terrifying. He did not know how long he could last if he continued to stay here. Therefore, he could only erupt with all his power and break the formation immediately. The longer he delayed, the more disadvantageous it would be for him. With a ripping sound, Chu Mu's back was cut open by the sword. Blood spurted out and the wound was so deep that his bones could be seen. Intense pain spread throughout his body, causing the corner of Chu Mu's eyes to twitch slightly. If he had not dodged fast enough, half of his body would have been cut open. Breaking through the sword puppet formation was also life-threatening. Not daring to hold back, Chu Mu took out a top-notch royal-grade sword in his left hand. With a flick of his wrist, he controlled his power and unleashed his profound realm sword. In the blink of an eye, 2 swords slashed at the same sword puppet. One sword broke the sword puppet's sword, while the other split the sword puppet's head. The 10 directions sword puppet was stronger than the other sword puppets. For example, Chu Mu only needed 1 sword to defeat the 9 transformation sword puppet, but the 10 directions sword puppet needed 2 swords. After 8 consecutive sword strikes, 4 sword puppets were defeated by Chu Mu. However, the 10 directions sword formation did not seem to be broken. The remaining 6 sword puppets changed their positions and formed a hexagonal sword formation that was even stronger than the previous one. From this point, one could see the difference between the 10 directions sword formation and the previous 8 sword formations. Dual swords. Could it be that Chu Mu is proficient in dual swords? The surrounding swordsmen were all shocked. Could it be that he did not use his full strength when breaking through the sword formation before? Chu Mu temporarily obtained a chance to catch his breath. He quickly executed the flying swan illusory steps and wandered around the sword formation to recover the energy he had expended. The pressure of the sword formation decreased significantly, and the suppression on Chu Mu was not as obvious. It was already within the range of Chu Mu's endurance. As long as he caught his breath, he would be able to defeat the sword formation. After 10 breaths, Chu Mu, who was wielding dual swords, recovered some of his strength and calmed down. Chu Mu controlled his muscles to close up, and the wound on his back stopped bleeding. He attacked again. With dual swords in hand, I am invincible. It had been a long time since Chu Mu used dual swords, but he did not give up on comprehending dual sword. His current dual swords had already reached the peak of Dishang, and its power was even stronger. 1 sword thrust, 1 sword slash, 1 sword slash, 1 sword parry, 1 sword attack. With dual swords in hand, he cooperated with each other, advancing and retreating in an orderly manner. His attacks and defenses interchanged as if they were made by heaven, and there were no flaws. Another sword puppet was defeated by Chu Mu's sword. The remaining 5 sword puppets changed again, forming the 5 elements sword formation. Kill, kill, kill. The remaining 4 sword puppets formed the 4 symbols sword formation, tripartite sword formation, duality sword formation. There was only 1 sword puppet left. This sword puppet's body shook, and from the other 9 sword puppets that had been defeated, streams of energy flew out and entered the body of the last sword puppet. The energy of this sword puppet suddenly increased by 2 times, and its sword attacks became sharper and more powerful. At this point in the battle, Chu Mu did not have much strength left. The wound on his back was closed, but it constantly emitted waves of tearing pain, disturbing Chu Mu's mind. This was because there were traces of tenacious sword intent wreaking havoc in the wound. The last one. Chu Mu's face was pale as he clenched his teeth. This was the final moment, and he could not waste all his previous efforts. He had to defeat the last sword puppet. Chapter 681. One-on-one. At this time, Chu Mu was relying on his incomparably tenacious willpower. The stinging pain from the wound on his back constantly assaulted his entire body. Chu Mu held a sword in each hand as he faced off against the remaining sword puppet. The powerful sword puppet's powerful and imposing aura wantonly condensed into one that charged towards Chu Mu. It was as if 10,000 swords were hurtling towards him, causing Chu Mu's protective sword aura to shatter. The long robe on his body was sliced open, causing him to cut a very sorry figure. There were also several small wounds on his face, blood seeping out. However, Chu Mu's expression did not change. He did not move at all. His eyes flashed as he stared at the sword puppet opposite him. The strength in his body was slowly recovering. The sword puppet moved. It turned into an afterimage and surpassed Chu Mu's line of sight. It attacked with a sword. This sword strike was like wind, water, fire, and thunder. Chu Mu's heart trembled. His two swords transformed into a coiling dragon and a fierce tiger. The two figures collided in an instant and then crossed each other. Chu Mu's two swords instantly crossed. One was forward, one was backward, one was up, and one was down. Two obscure sword light crossed each other. The moment the two swords attacked, Chu Mu used deep penetration. These two swords entered deep penetration and used up all of Chu Mu's remaining strength in one fell swoop. A feeling of weakness and emptiness instantly enveloped his body. Chu Mu had no choice but to use his sword to support his body. His breathing was disordered, his head was dizzy, and the scene in front of him was somewhat blurry. If the sword puppet attacked again at this time, Chu Mu would be in danger. However, the sword puppet did not move. It maintained its posture of stabbing out with its sword. Two sword marks appeared on its body, forming a cross and passing through its body. In the next breath, the sword puppet's body swayed and fell, splitting into 4 pieces. He passed. Chu Mu really passed the last stage of the sword puppet formation. The spectating swordsmen cried out in surprise. They were filled with disbelief, shock, and excitement. Chu Mu was still recovering his strength in the Decagon sword array. The Decagon sword array automatically recovered, and Chu Mu was surprised to find that a ball of light had appeared in front of him, emitting a mysterious fluctuation. Chu Mu grabbed the ball of light and pressed it against his forehead. Instantly, a stream of information flowed from the ball of light into Chu Mu's forehead. Sword Formation Basics. After the transmission of the information in the ball of light was completed, it disappeared again. Chu Mu stood in the middle of the sword array, recovering his strength while closing his eyes to read the information in his mind. The foundation of the sword formation was also the basic sword formation. It included the arrangement method, principle, composition, operation, transformation, and other profoundness of the yin-yang sword formation to the 10-direction sword formation. Chu Mu only gave it a cursory glance and immediately understood that the foundation of this sword formation contained a complete basic sword formation, starting from the yin-yang sword formation, followed by the tripartite sword formation, the 4 symbols sword formation, and finally the 10 directions sword formation. There was a lot of content in the sword formation, and it contained a lot of profoundness. It required a lot of time to comprehend it, and now was not a good time. After recovering some of his strength, Chu Mu put away his 2 swords and left the 10 directions sword array with a thought. According to instructor Ji Tianxiang, he was the 3rd disciple since the establishment of the Sky Edge Sword Palace to pass the last stage of the puppet sword formation, the 10 directions sword array. He would be recorded in the Sword Palace's history. The swordsmen automatically made way for Chu Mu, and all of them paid respect to Chu Mu with deep reverence in their eyes. At this moment, Chu Mu had completely conquered them. The image of Sikong Zhan in the swordsmen's hearts was completely shattered, and was replaced by an even larger and more condensed image. It was Chu Mu, the #1 official disciple of the Sky Edge Sword Palace, the well-deserved #1. What? You still want to say that Chu Mu is inferior to Sikong Zhan? How is that possible? Chu Mu can pass the last stage of the puppet sword formation, but can Sikong Zhan pass it? If Sikong Zhan could pass it, he would have done it long ago. Even Sikong Zhan, who had become an elite disciple, might not be able to raise his strength to the point where he could pass the 9th stage of the puppet sword formation in just over a month. At this point, Chu Mu's position in the hearts of the official disciples of the Sky Edge Sword Palace was unparalleled, unless there was someone else who could pass the 9th stage of the puppet sword formation. Soon, the news of Chu Mu passing the 9th stage of the puppet sword formation spread out. Every instructor knew about it, and Instructor Ji Tianxiang was grinning from ear to ear the entire day. "Good kid, you really did not disappoint me." After some time, Chu Mu carefully read through the basics of the sword formation. Because he had passed the puppet sword formation a few times before, he had some understanding of the duality sword formation to the 9 revolutions sword formation. He had already surpassed the superficial level and reached the beginner level. As a result, Chu Mu naturally gained various comprehensions from the bottom of his heart as he read it carefully. His understanding of the various sword formations deepened by a bit. However, sword formations were still sword formations in the end. They were broad and profound, and it was not easy to completely comprehend them. It often required extremely high comprehension ability and a long period of research and comprehension. Those with insufficient comprehension ability would not be able to comprehend the beginner level no matter how much time they spent. Chu Mu carefully read it a few more times. He savored it one by one and understood it word by word. After that, he put it together and understood it as a whole. Immediately, his understanding of the various basic sword formations deepened again. Although it is only the basics of the sword formation, it contains various mysteries. It will take at least a few years to completely comprehend it, so a day or two won't make much of a difference. I'll first recover the energy I used to pass the sword formation, and then I'll apply for the sword exalt test. Chu Mu said slowly as he slowly exhaled. Strands of white filth shot into the sky like swords, only dispersing a dozen meters away. Closing his eyes, the world disappeared and fell into darkness. All distracting thoughts were obliterated in the darkness and turned into nothingness. In less than 3 breaths of time, Chu Mu entered a meditative state. The consciousness star in his spiritual world was dim and lightless. This was because his spiritual consciousness had been overused when he passed the sword formation of 10 directions. The Southern Dipper mind refining scripture operated the Heavenly Mansion Stars chapter. There seemed to be a faint light flickering in the dim consciousness star. As time passed and the cultivation method operated, the faint light gradually grew stronger. Gradually, the starlight flickered and became bright. The consumed spiritual consciousness was also rapidly recovering. A few hours later, the consciousness star in his spiritual world shone brightly. It was like a real star hanging high in the sky. His spiritual consciousness had been completely restored. Ordinary swordsmen would often fall into a coma once their spiritual consciousness was overused. They would only wake up when their spiritual consciousness naturally recovered a little. However, Chu Mu was different. He cultivated the Southern Dipper mind refining scripture. The Southern Dipper mind refining scripture had a total of 6 chapters. Chu Mu had cultivated the first chapter and condensed a consciousness star, concentrating all his thoughts. After that, the potential of his spiritual consciousness was constantly developed. The most primitive spiritual consciousness that had not been tempered began to exist in his spiritual world. Although this spiritual consciousness was not pure enough and its strength was very low, it was enough to keep Chu Mu awake. When his spiritual consciousness recovered to its peak, Chu Mu began to operate the Heavenly Desolate Sword scripture to restore the Heavenly Desolate Sword origin. As for his physical strength, it naturally recovered in the process of restoring his spiritual consciousness. The consumption this time was too great. It was not until the next morning that he completely recovered. After recovering, Chu Mu felt refreshed again. There was a feeling of being reborn after being broken. On the first floor of the sword tower, Chu Mu practiced a few rounds of swordsmanship. After stretching his muscles and bones, he left the sword tower and went to the residence of instructor Ji Tianxiang. Ji Tianxiang rubbed his chin with his index finger and thumb as he walked around Chu Mu. His narrowed eyes were filled with a sharp light as they fell on Chu Mu. It was as if he wanted to see through Chu Mu. From time to time, a clicking sound came from his mouth. No matter how one looked at him, he looked like a wretched uncle. Good boy. Good boy. Ji Tianxiang finally stopped walking. He stood in front of Chu Mu and sighed repeatedly. The immemorial world was full of outstanding people. There were countless geniuses and experts. However, he had never seen or heard of someone like Chu Mu, who was improving rapidly almost every moment. Your sword intent and profundity have probably already been tempered to the fourth revolution, right? Ji Tianxiang exclaimed in admiration as he said, "Half a year. In merely half a year, your sword intent and profound power have been refined to the fourth revolution. It's unimaginable." Thinking back, it took him an entire 10 years to refine from perfection to the fourth revolution. That speed could be considered to be above average. However, after reaching the fourth revolution, no matter how hard he tried, he was unable to improve because it was already the limit of what his soul could endure. I estimate that with the strength of your soul, it's enough to refine your sword intent and profound power to the fifth or even sixth revolution. Ji Tianxiang exclaimed in admiration again, "Once it's refined to the sixth revolution, you'll be a peak existence among the elite disciples." Chu Mu did not speak, but his heart shook when he heard Ji Tianxiang's words. In other words, there were swordsmen who had refined their sword intent and profound to the sixth revolution among the elite disciples. However, there shouldn't be many of them. As for whether there were swordsmen who had refined their sword intent and profound to the seventh revolution, that was unknown. "Instructor, I would like to apply for the Venerable Sword examination," Chu Mu said after a thought. "There are only 2 days left until the time set by the head instructor. It's indeed time for you to take the Venerable Sword examination." Ji Tianxiang nodded his head. He already knew why Chu Mu had come. The Sword Sovereign exam isn't hard with your current strength. However, you still have to be careful because there may be some accident. This is something every sword practitioner can't avoid during the exam. Chu Mu did not know if the Venerable Sword examination in the immemorial world was the same as the one in the Ancient Sword Continent. If it was just the Ancient Sword Continent's examination method, he was confident that he could pass easily. "Follow me, I'll give you a simple explanation of the Venerable Sword examination method," Ji Tianxiang said as he led Chu Mu out of the sword tower and towards the Venerable Sword examination location. As one of the 3 major human factions in the Xilin continent, the Sky Edge Sword Palace naturally had the qualifications to take the Venerable Sword examination. Not long after, Chu Mu followed Ji Tianxiang to the mission hall of the Sky Edge Sword Palace's official disciple area. Under Chu Mu's astonishment, Ji Tianxiang led Chu Mu deeper into the hall and pushed open a closed door. Chapter 682. The trunk of the tree was so thick that it would take dozens of people to wrap their arms around it. It was more than 100 zhang tall, and the huge tree crown was like a dark green canopy that covered a radius of several hundred zhang. Such towering and ancient trees could be seen everywhere. They were shaped like sharp swords that were at least 1 zhang tall. They were greenish-black, straight and tough, and pointed to the sky. Vaguely, there seemed to be traces of sharpness. The surrounding grass could be seen everywhere. There were also millstone-sized saw-toothed leaves that twined in circles. The thick vines that were as thick as an arm or a leg, and had a greenish-black skin that seemed to have dark red blood vessels inside them crawling all over the thick tree trunk. This was the forest of the immemorial world. It was an extremely ancient and primitive forest. The sun of the immemorial world hung high in the sky, illuminating the earth. The blazing light was like countless sharp swords that shot down, penetrating through the canopy of the towering trees, through the dense branches and leaves, and through the countless gaps. It scattered on the ancient and primitive grass of the forest, forming countless mottled silhouettes. A tranquil aura spread through the forest, as if it was emitted from the giant trees, the grass, and the vines. It added a bit of mystery to this ancient and primitive forest. A figure leisurely appeared, and the grass in front of him naturally parted a little. Chu Mu's fingers gently stroked the grass, and he was slightly surprised. The grass of the immemorial world was sharp and tough, and was actually not inferior to a middle-grade sword. In other words, if this grass was brought back to the ancient sword continent and slightly modified, it could become a middle-grade mystic sword. However, such grass could be found all over the ground. Chu Mu's footsteps were silent. His arrival did not cause any changes in the aura of this ancient and primitive forest, because he had perfectly concealed his aura. The condensation of the intense star allowed Chu Mu to use the hidden edge art to the extreme. Why did Chu Mu leave the Sky Edge Sword Palace and come to this ancient and primitive forest? It was very simple. It was for the Sword Venerates test. As expected, the Sword Venerates test in the immemorial world was completely different from the one in the ancient Sword Continent. The Sword Venerates test in the ancient Sword Continent was to fight an opponent in the 100 Saints Alliance's branch palace, and defeat that opponent to become a Sword Venerate. The Sword Venerates test in the immemorial world was much more difficult and dangerous. This was because the Sword Saint examination in the immemorial world required one to truly kill a powerful enemy. As for what kind of powerful enemy it wasn't certain. The examination would be randomly selected. Chu Mu had drawn a new assessment mission. The content of the assessment was to enter the dark forest to the north of the Sky Edge Sword Palace and find and kill a group of human evil swordsmen. There were a total of 5 of them. There were both good and evil swordsmen of the human race, and they had existed since ancient times. Sword practitioners of the righteous path absorbed the spiritual energy of heaven and earth to temper their bodies. They stepped onto the path of the sword and fought against the heavens. However, sword practitioners of the evil path were different. They were a group of evil existences who had lost themselves in the pursuit of power. They killed many, consumed blood, and refined souls. In order to increase their own strength, they would do anything. There were even some sword practitioners of the evil path who had become neither human nor ghost. Recently, these 5 swordsmen of the evil path had attacked several times. They had massacred the humans living near the dark forest and sucked their blood and marrow dry. This had caused quite a bit of panic. This matter was reported to the Sky Edge Sword Palace. After the sword of Gojoseon of the Sky Edge Sword Palace had checked the corpses, he concluded that there were at least 5 evil swordsmen who had committed the crime. They were all in the Origin Realm, and their sword intent and profound had not yet reached the second transformation. Therefore, it became a mission. However, the disciples of the Sky Edge Sword Palace who had accepted the mission never returned. However, the 5 swordsmen of the evil path seemed to know that their whereabouts had been exposed, so they hid in the dark forest and never appeared again. Therefore, this mission was upgraded to a Sword Venerate assessment mission. If the swordsmen of the assessment were unable to complete this mission, the mission would be upgraded again and become an elite disciple mission. The dark forest was very big. Finding the 5 evil swordsmen of the evil path was like finding a needle in a haystack. If the 5 swordsmen of the evil path were determined to hide, even a few sword of Gojoseon would not be able to find them. Chu Mu restrained his aura, but released his spiritual consciousness. It covered 100-meter radius. Even the smallest speck of dust could be detected by Chu Mu's spiritual consciousness. Even the slightest movement could not escape from Chu Mu's spiritual consciousness. The Sword Venerate assessment mission was randomly selected. It would be the mission that was chosen. If one wanted to change the mission, they would have to give up the mission. They would have to wait another 3 months before they could apply for the assessment again. Chu Mu's agreement with the head instructor was close. There was only a little more than a day left. Chu Mu still had to complete the mission in a little more than a day to become a Sword Venerate. Only then would he have completed the mission and obtained the benefits he deserved. When Chu Mu had drawn this mission, Ji Tianxiang had frowned. He knew that the difficulty of this mission did not lie in the 5 swordsmen's strength. That was because he believed that with Chu Mu's 4th cycle sword intent and profundity, it would not be difficult for him to deal with 5 first cycle sword intent and profundity corrupt swordsmen. The true difficulty was finding the whereabouts of the 5 swordsmen of the evil path. Chu Mu only had a day to go back and forth. To find the 5 swordsmen of the evil path in the dark forest was like finding a needle in a haystack. It was practically impossible. Ji Tianxiang had even seen the scene of Chu Mu's failure. At that time, he had wanted to use some of his power and connections to have Chu Mu change the mission. But Chu Mu had refused. Chu Mu had his own persistence. Furthermore, it was not impossible for him to complete this mission in a day. Furthermore, passing the 10-directional sword formation had given him 12,700 sky edge coins. Adding on the 6,000 from before, Chu Mu now had over 19,000 sky edge coins. Entering the Dream Recall Pavilion only required 10,000 sky edge coins. Even if he couldn't complete the mission and couldn't complete his agreement with the head instructor, Chu Mu could still use the money he had earned to enter the Dream Recall Pavilion. However, between the two, Chu Mu was more inclined to complete his agreement with the head instructor. There was no other reason than his conviction. The dark forest was silent. There wasn't even any wind. But Chu Mu knew that this place was filled with danger. That was because there were primordial vicious beasts living in the dark forest. These primordial vicious beasts all had their own territories. They were usually hidden and would not casually appear. The dark forest is huge. It will be difficult for me to find 5 corrupt swordsmen by myself. Chu Mu's thoughts rapidly spun. Those corrupt swordsmen absorb blood and bone marrow to cultivate. Since that's the case, why don't I have them come to find me? If he wanted the corrupt swordsmen to come find him, he would first have to create a large enough commotion. Furthermore, he couldn't display too much strength. Otherwise, it would scare them away. With a thought, Chu Mu made his decision. With a thought, a fierce aura was released from Chu Mu's body. In an instant, it swept out like a storm, attacking in all directions and causing the surrounding grass to bend and sway. The strength of this aura had reached the level of first cycle sword intent and first cycle profound. The sharp aura was not concealed at all. It soared into the sky, wreaking havoc in all directions. It was extremely ostentatious, as if it was afraid others wouldn't know there was someone here. Even thousands of meters away they could sense this aura. The hidden ancient beast was immediately alerted. To it, humans were like delicacies. Rustling sounds could be heard. Not far away, the tall grass was crushed, leaving behind a long trail. Chu Mu immediately sensed a vicious aura surging over, bringing with it a bone-chilling coldness. It was a python, an ancient python. Its body was as thick as a bucket, and its body was covered in colorful markings. Its eyes were green, and its forked tongue was wildly flicking. From the vicious aura emitted by this python, Chu Mu immediately knew that this was a high-tier vicious beast. It was equivalent to a human-origin realm swordsman, and the kind that had reached the peak. As soon as the python appeared, it immediately stared at Chu Mu and launched an attack. Its thick body spun and shot out like a huge crossbow, causing the sound of wind breaking to resound. Chu Mu shifted his feet and easily dodged the python's surprise attack. The terrifying wind was extremely sharp and sliced towards him, but it was blocked by the protective sword aura outside of Chu Mu's skin. The python was very experienced in battle. When its surprise attack failed, it swung its thick tail like a steel whip. The wind broke through the air, causing an earth-shattering roar to resound. Although this python was powerful, Chu Mu could easily kill it if he wanted to. However, he had to control his strength and couldn't appear too strong. Pretending to be in a difficult situation as he dodged the python's tail whip, Chu Mu pulled out his sword and counterattacked. He and the python became entangled in a fierce fight. This python's body was as thick as a bucket, and it was about 20 meters long. Every time it attacked, it would cause a huge commotion. Waves of sound spread out, and the intense collision of auras could be felt even further away. In order to increase the commotion, Chu Mu retreated as he fought with the python. Wherever he went, the grass would be destroyed. Sword aura would sweep through the air, and even the trunks of the giant trees would be left with slash marks, causing wood chips to fly everywhere. A high-rank archaic vicious beast already possessed a considerable amount of intelligence. However, this python didn't know that its opponent was suppressing most of his strength, using only a small part of his strength to fight with it. His goal was to create a bigger commotion. After a quarter of an hour, the area within 1,000 meters was destroyed. Chu Mu was still fighting with the python. A high-tier dire beast's body was incomparably tyrannical, and its strength was even more terrifying. A flick of this python's tail was enough to shake a towering tree that required dozens of people to wrap their arms around it. If a tree that required dozens of people to wrap their arms around it was hit by the python's tail, a crack would appear on the tree trunk. After another hit, the tree would slowly fall down with creaking sounds. Rumble! When such a thick tree fell, it heavily smashed into the ground, causing dust to fly. The commotion was unbelievably great. The ground within a radius of several tens of thousands of meters shook because of it. However, Chu Mu felt that this commotion wasn't big enough. He needed a bigger commotion. Thus, he turned his gaze to a towering tree that required dozens of people to wrap their arms around it. He imagined that if such a towering tree fell to the ground without any obstacles, what kind of vibration would that heavy blow bring? What kind of commotion would that cause? Chapter 683. Big Brother, it's already been many days since we've tasted human blood. If this continues, I won't be able to take it, whispered one of the 5 figures. Endure it for a bit longer. Previously, the Sky Edge Sword Palace's disciples came to kill us. Although they were killed by us in the end, the Sky Edge Sword Palace will definitely take this matter seriously. During this time, we'll do our best to keep a low profile and make them lower their guard. Just thinking about it makes me angry. Since when did we, the 5 bloodthirsty tigers, have to be so cautious? That damn Sky Edge Sword Palace. If there comes a day when I am strong enough, I will definitely uproot that Sky Edge Sword Palace and suck them dry. Alright, let's not talk about such unrealistic things. Let's just obediently go hunt some vicious beasts. Vicious beasts' blood marrow is much stronger than humans. It'll be even more beneficial to our cultivation. But a vicious beast's blood marrow isn't as delicious as a human's. As they were complaining, the ground trembled slightly. Although it was very weak, the 5 of them still felt it. It's definitely a battle between vicious beasts. Let's go. Immediately, the 5 of them rushed in the direction of the trembling. Whether it was a battle between vicious beasts or a battle between vicious beasts and swordsmen, they could easily take advantage of the situation. Chu Mu and the python's battle continued. After a while, Chu Mu suddenly sensed a faint trace of a strange aura in the chaotic air. If he hadn't condensed his will star, he wouldn't have been able to sense it. This faint trace of a strange aura contained a savage, sinister, and bloodthirsty aura. As soon as his mind came in contact with it, he felt a chill spread. It was very uncomfortable. Chu Mu guessed that a corrupt swordsman was approaching, but he didn't know how many of them there were. It's actually a swordsman fighting a spotted python. He can't even handle a spotted python. This kind of strength is too weak. 5 figures approached, hiding behind a huge tree. They were hiding in the grass, watching the battle between Chu Mu and the spotted python. They were evaluating Chu Mu's strength. That's great. I can finally taste human blood again. Don't worry. I have a feeling that something is wrong. The leader of the 5 bloodthirsty tigers said in a low voice. Big brother, what's wrong? This swordsman must be a disciple of the Sky Edge Sword Palace. He thinks he has some strength and came to the dark forest to train. He doesn't know the immensity of heaven and earth. This kind of thing was not uncommon. Compared to swordsmen like them who had grown up amidst countless massacres, the disciples of the Sky Edge Sword Palace were like flowers in a greenhouse. However, there were always exceptions. Big brother, let's make a move. We'll seriously injure that person and the mottled python before sucking their blood marrow. That kind of taste is the most wonderful. There was a difference in the taste of the blood marrow of the living and the dead. Let's wait a little longer. The leader of the 5 bloodthirsty tigers was more cautious. After another quarter of an hour, Chu Mu was injured. The spotted python also had many wounds on its body. Both sides were evenly matched. Big brother, what are we waiting for? If we continue, the blood marrow won't taste good anymore. All right, let's do it. The leader of the 5 bloodthirsty tigers finally gave the order. After a period of observation, he couldn't find any flaws. Immediately, 5 figures shot out from the grass behind the tree trunk. Although they felt that Chu Mu and the piebald python were too weak, they didn't hold back in the slightest when they attacked. This originated from their habit of killing for many years. A lion would use all its strength when hunting a rabbit. The moment the 5 bloodthirsty tigers made their move, the evil aura in the air increased several times, turning into a bloodthirsty tide that rushed over. Chu Mu and the mottled python paused. The mottled python's eyes were filled with fear. It swayed its body, intending to escape. However, it was still one step too late. A scarlet sword light slashed down, directly cutting the mottled python in two. Then, the 5 figures landed beside the mottled python. 5 swords pierced into the python's severed body. Evil arts were activated, and the blood marrow turned into energy that flowed through the swords into the bodies of the 5 people. In just 10 breaths of time, the thick mottled python's blood and marrow were sucked dry. Its vitality was completely gone, and it emitted an aura of death as if it had been dead for a long time. 5 bloodthirsty and evil gazes fell on Chu Mu's body. Immediately, Chu Mu felt a burst of coldness spread throughout his body. The 5 figures in front of him were clearly human. However, their pupils were scarlet, and their skin was pale as if they were seriously ill and had lost too much blood. There were gray spots on their skin, and the veins on their necks bulged like earthworms. "It's your misfortune to meet us, the 5 bloodthirsty tigers," one of them said. His voice was low and gloomy, with a trace of hoarseness that could give people nightmares. "Perhaps it's my luck." Chu Mu laughed instead. He was sure that these 5 people were the 5 evil path swordsmen, the targets of his mission this time. The eldest of the 5 bloodthirsty tigers raised his eyebrows. He subconsciously felt that something was wrong, but he couldn't tell what it was. He hastily shouted, "Attack!" Immediately, the 5 bloodthirsty tigers transformed into 5 rays of bloody light that shot toward Chu Mu from 5 different directions. Their swords pierced through the air like bloody meteors, shooting toward Chu Mu. A gloomy and evil aura instantly enveloped Chu Mu's body. If Chu Mu's strength was limited to this, he would definitely be surrounded by these 5 gloomy and evil auras and lose all ability to resist, allowing himself to be slaughtered. Unfortunately, Chu Mu's strength wasn't limited to this. Just as the 5 bloodthirsty tigers' swords were about to pierce Chu Mu's skin, their eyes emitted a dense bloody light. It was as if they had already enjoyed the wonderful taste of blood marrow. What they didn't know was that Chu Mu could clearly see the trajectories of their attacks. As long as Chu Mu wanted to, he could easily dodge them. However, the eldest of the 5 bloodthirsty tigers was a bit more profound. He was close to the second revolution, but he was still too weak. The 8-sided desolate sky sword was unsheathed, and a blurry sword light swept through the army in an arc. It quickly swept past the necks of the bloodthirsty 5 tigers without missing. Even the swords of the bloodthirsty 5 tigers were knocked away, unable to deal any damage to Chu Mu. The 5 bloodthirsty tigers' left hands clutched their throat. Their scarlet eyes were filled with shock and disbelief. They pointed at Chu Mu and struggled to open their mouths. They only managed to say one word before blood spurted out from their throat. Their bodies trembled, and the scarlet color in their eyes quickly faded. Their bodies slowly fell back. With a bang, the 5 corpses fell to the ground, sending dust flying. Chu Mu immediately took off the spatial rings of the 5 bloodthirsty tigers, as well as the 5 dark red swords. He didn't let go of the corpses either. That was the proof of completing the mission. It's time to go back. Silently muttering to himself, Chu Mu immediately retracted his aura and left the dark forest, returning to the Heavenly Edge Sword Palace. You're back. It's fine if you didn't complete the mission. This kind of mission is even more difficult than the other Sword Saint missions. I've already reported it to the head instructor, and he has agreed for you to immediately change the mission, said Ji Tianxiang hastily as soon as he saw Chu Mu. I've already completed the mission, said Chu Mu. Completed the mission, what? You've completed the mission. Ji Tianxiang's eyes widened. Even the head instructor was startled. The mission Chu Mu had chosen was also within the scope of the Sword Saint trial, but it was even more difficult than the other Sword Saint trial missions. The Sword Saint trial standard was the strength of one's first cycle sword intent and first cycle profundity. The 5 corrupt swordsmen all had the strength of one's first cycle sword intent and first cycle profundity. To complete such a mission, not only did you have to be powerful, you also had to have outstanding abilities. Ordinary sword saints with first cycle sword intent and first cycle profundity would find it extremely difficult to complete. Chu Mu could kill those 5 evil path swordsmen. Ji Tianxiang had 100% confidence in that. The problem was finding those 5 evil path swordsmen. My luck wasn't bad. Not long after I entered the dark forest, I was targeted by them, so... Chu Mu gave a simple explanation. So that's how it was. It's their fault for being so unlucky. Ji Tianxiang was startled, but then he laughed involuntarily. Those 5 corrupt swordsmen might have some abilities, but in front of absolute power, they were no match for Chu Mu. They probably didn't even have the qualifications to escape. Since you said you've completed the mission, then show us the relevant evidence, said the other instructor. Chu Mu waved his hand and 5 corpses and 5 dark red swords appeared on the ground. A sinister aura was constantly emitting from the corpses and swords, filling the surroundings. Ji Tianxiang and the instructor frowned as a look of deep hatred flashed across their eyes. Not a single righteous swordsman would welcome the corrupt swordsman. Follow me. That instructor glanced at the 5 corpses and knew that Chu Mu had truly completed the mission. So he turned to Chu Mu. Then he brought Chu Mu through a secret passage and into a huge private room. The room was completely empty. There was only a 300-meter sword steel in the center. On the sword steel, there were names that flickered with different colors. Behind the names were titles. Those were the titles of sword saints. Use your sword to carve your name and title on the sword steel. The instructor pointed to the sword steel and said to Chu Mu. Chu Mu nodded and leaped into the air. As he approached the sword steel, he unsheathed his 8 desolate heaven swords. Sword light shone brightly. He was like a calligraphy master. Starting from the highest point of the sword steel, he gradually moved down. As Chu Mu's sword moved, a large Chu character appeared on the sword's steel. It released a golden light as if it had been embedded into the sword's steel. Following that, the second character, Chu Mu, was also written by Chu Mu. It was embedded into the sword's steel once more. The third character, the fourth character, the fifth character, the sixth character, Chu Mu's figure slowly descended. With a flick of his wrist, the 8 desolate sky swords were like an extension of his arm. In one breath, he left 6 golden words on the sword's steel. Looking closely, one could see that the edges of the 6 golden words seemed to be constantly vibrating. Chu Mu, Sword Saint Gentian. Chapter 684. The 6 golden words shrunk rapidly and flew away from the sword's steel like a golden dragon. They circled around the sword's steel again, and finally stopped at an empty spot on the sword's steel. They stuck close to the sword's steel and wanted to embed themselves into it. The entire sword's steel suddenly trembled, as if it was trying to stop the 6 golden words from being embedded. Chu Mu was startled and did not understand what was going on. The instructor was also startled before a look of understanding flashed across his eyes. After some resistance, the sword's steel stopped trembling and the 6 golden words finally embedded themselves into the sword's steel. The golden light was restrained, and it was like a ripple that slowly flowed through it. Faintly, Chu Mu felt a mystical power descend and instantly entered his body. He immediately felt refreshed, as if he had surpassed his peak. That was luck. There is one thing I have to tell you. The instructor turned around and stared at Chu Mu. He said, outside of the Purple Lingji continent, other than you, there are other sword sovereigns who use the title of Gentian. I do not know if it is one or a few, but in any case, you will definitely meet them in the future and compete for the title of Gentian. Chu Mu was startled when he heard this, but he quickly accepted it. There were so many people in the ancient immemorial world. Other than him, there were definitely other swordsmen who used the title of Gentian. Chu Mu was very open-minded about it. Let's go. I will bring you to the Dream Recall Pavilion. Ji Tianxiang said to Chu Mu, after you come out of the Dream Recall Pavilion, I will bring you to the head instructor. At that time, you can make a request to the head instructor. The Dream Recall Pavilion was located in a relatively remote area. It was almost at the edge of the Sky Edge Sword Palace. It looked like a very simple pavilion that had experienced the vicissitudes of life. There did not seem to be anything special about it. Those who did not know would definitely think that it was an abandoned pavilion. When Chu Mu saw the pavilion, he was also stunned. Ji Tianxiang, on the other hand, smiled mysteriously and didn't say anything. In theory, every swordsman has one chance to enter the Dream Recall Tower in their lifetime. However, every time the Dream Recall Tower is opened, it consumes a large amount of energy. Therefore, the Sword Palace has a rule that the Dream Recall Tower can only be opened once a month. Swordsmen who want to enter the Dream Recall Tower must apply in advance and wait for arrangement. Ji Tianxiang explained with a smile as he walked to the front of the Dream Recall Tower. It opens once a month. It opens 12 times a year. There are more than 2 million disciples in the entire Sword Palace. Counting it this way, it was unknown how many swordsmen were unable to enter the Dream Recall Tower in their entire lives. Although it's not difficult for you to enter the Dream Recall Pavilion for 10,000 Sky Edge coins, if you want to apply for it yourself, you'll have to wait for a few years before you have the chance. Ji Tianxiang smiled. Only now did Chu Mu understand that the opportunity the head instructor gave him this time wasn't to save 10,000 Sky Edge coins, but to save a few years of time. The meaning was completely different. Originally, the opportunity to enter the Dream Recall Tower this month belonged to an elite disciple. However, it has now been taken up by you. Therefore, after you become an elite disciple, you might encounter some troublesome matters. Ji Tianxiang smiled again. This kind of matter will be handled by you personally. Alright, go in. Chumu couldn't help but smile when he heard this. He didn't expect that entering the Dream Recall Tower would bring him trouble. However, trouble was trouble. Since there was a problem, he just had to deal with it. In the world of swordsmen, the best way to deal with trouble was to use absolute strength to defeat the opponent. Then, the trouble would naturally disappear. Taking a step forward, Ji Tianxiang walked towards the ordinary-looking ancient pavilion. He smiled and took out a medallion. With a thought, he communicated with the medallion. The instant Chu Mu entered the Dream Recall Tower, the Dream Recall Tower also opened and began to operate. This life and the future are indefinite. Once you enter the Dream Recall Tower, you will be alive for 100 years. A majestic and ancient voice slowly rang out. It came from the void, drifting indeterminately. However, it was also grand and dignified. It was like the evening drum or morning bell, entering Chu Mu's ears and ringing in Chu Mu's heart. The world was dark, causing Chu Mu to be at a loss. In an instant, countless specks of silver starlight appeared from the darkness in front of him. They were like countless fireflies dancing and spiraling over. They swept past Chu Mu's body, causing Chu Mu to feel as if he was in a long river of starlight. The silver starlight unceasingly flowed behind him, while the silver starlight in front of him unceasingly appeared. It was as if there was a source, but it was also endless. For a moment, Chu Mu felt as if he was in a dream. He also felt the flow of time. A second, a quarter, a day, a month, a year. Chu Mu could feel the flow of time more and more clearly. He suddenly had an epiphany. In the Dream Recall Tower, one had to see the path of one's future. The flow of time should be like this. Chu Mu also didn't know how long he had been here. However, he could feel that the silver starlight was the flow of time. 100 years had already passed. Suddenly, the source of the silver starlight dissipated. A blurry figure seemed to walk out from the void, appearing before Chu Mu's eyes. Chu Mu was stunned, because he saw it clearly. That figure was actually himself. No, more accurately speaking, it shouldn't be him. No, it should be him, his future self. His future self after 100 years. His appearance was exactly the same. He still looked so young. However, there were traces of vicissitudes at the corners of his eyes. That was left behind by the passage of time. His future self glanced at Chu Mu. That gaze seemed to pierce through 100 years of time and space, landing on Chu Mu's face, directly piercing into Chu Mu's heart. This caused Chu Mu's heart to tremble. He felt as though he had been seen through. Next, his future self unsheathed his sword. His aura suddenly underwent an earth-shattering change. A terrifying sharpness covered the sky, bringing with it a hint of the opening of the heavens and earth. Sword Dao. For no reason, this thought subconsciously appeared in Chu Mu's mind. That kind of aura that felt like the opening of the heavens and earth was definitely a type of Sword Dao. In other words, his future self already had a Sword Dao. It was just that he didn't know if he created it himself or obtained it from an inheritance. No matter what, seeing his future self already having a Sword Dao, Chu Mu couldn't help but feel excited in his heart. Next, his future self began to practice swordsmanship. All the distracting thoughts in Chu Mu's heart disappeared. His eyes stared straight ahead, staring at his future self. There were no other thoughts in his mind, because that swordsmanship had already shocked Chu Mu. It turned out that his future self's swordsmanship could reach such a level. With a wave of his sword, it was as if he had opened up a small world. It was as if under the sword there was a small world. Life and death, the cycle of life and death, everything was under the sword. His future self's sword seemed to contain the infinite mysteries of the heavens and earth. All kinds of things were in it, interpreted by the simple and unadorned swordsmanship. It seemed that the swordsmanship was very simple, no different from the basic swordsmanship. However, even the current Chu Mu could only feel a little bit of its mysteries. Carefully staring at his future self's sword, Chu Mu felt that each sword contained a different mystery. Vaguely, he seemed to see all kinds of power related to the mysteries. He also saw the shadow of Zhen Tian's penetrating force. Could it be that this is my path, to control many mysteries, to master the Zhen Tian's penetrating force and the penetrating force? Chu Mu couldn't help but be startled. While he was watching his future self, the star of consciousness in his spiritual world kept flickering, and the spiritual consciousness contained in it was also constantly being consumed. As he watched, Chu Mu suddenly realized that his future self seemed to be gradually fading away from him. It was gradually getting farther and farther away from him, as if they were separated by layers of time and space. What's going on? Chu Mu's eyes widened and shone brightly, but he still couldn't see his future self clearly. Instead, it kept fading, blurring, and becoming distant. His future self disappeared, and the silver starlight appeared again. This time, it flowed back from behind him to the front. Chu Mu once again felt the flow of time, but this time, it was the opposite of the flow of time before. Is it time? He muttered to himself. Although he had many regrets in his heart, there was nothing he could do. If he could see more of his future self, he would definitely be able to comprehend more. All the silver starlight flowed back and disappeared into the world of darkness. This life and the future are indefinite. Once you enter the dream, you will be alive for 100 years. The old and majestic voice rang out again, filling Chu Mu's body and directly penetrating his soul. Hearing it for the second time, he felt even more emotional and experienced than before. That vicissitude, that vision, that endless desire for the future, he actually lasted for such a long time. It seems that the strength of his soul is beyond my expectations. Ji Tianxiang had been standing outside the Dream Recall Pavilion. The longer you last, the more you see the future, and the clearer your future path will be. I'm more and more looking forward to seeing how far you can go. Entering the Dream Recall Pavilion, exhausted one's spiritual consciousness. The stronger one's spiritual consciousness was, the more advantageous it would be. While Ji Tianxiang was talking to himself, Chu Mu's figure walked out from the Dream Recall Pavilion. Seeing Chu Mu's figure, Ji Tianxiang felt lost in that instant. This was because Chu Mu's body seemed to carry the vicissitudes of time and space. These vicissitudes of time and space were deep and profound, as if they contained endless mysteries of the universe. This shocked Ji Tianxiang's mind. In just a breath, Ji Tianxiang regained his senses. When he looked at Chu Mu again, it was no different from when he entered the Dream Recall Pavilion. However, Ji Tianxiang knew that what he saw just now was not an illusion. He, who had a deeper understanding of the Dream Recall Pavilion, knew that every person who entered the Dream Recall Pavilion would carry traces of their future self's aura when they came out. This aura was also a kind of judgment of their future self's achievements. Ji Tianxiang had personally seen swordsmen walk out of the Dream Recall Pavilion many times. However, there was not a single time like this where his mind was shocked and he almost lost himself in it. It could be concluded that Chu Mu's future achievements far exceeded his expectations. Sword Saint. Our human race will definitely have another Sword Saint. Ji Tianxiang could not help but feel secretly excited. Let's go. Follow me to see the head instructor. Ji Tianxiang smiled at Chu Mu. Okay. Chu Mu nodded. He turned his head and glanced at the Dream Recall Pavilion before following Ji Tianxiang to the head instructor's sword tower.